Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was the summer of 2012. I remember it vividly because it was a time in my life when everything felt ordinary. And yet, nothing about this story is ordinary. Back then, I had just graduated college and had moved back to my hometown in upstate New York. It was a small, sleepy place surrounded by dense forests, rolling hills, and winding country roads. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. My best friend Ethan and I had known each other since grade school. Ethan was the kind of guy who was always up for an adventure, reckless but loyal to a fault. If something sounded even remotely exciting or out of the ordinary, he was the first one to suggest, "Let's check it out." I suppose it's why we got along so well. That summer, most of our days were spent working odd jobs and our evenings driving around in my beat-up Honda Civic. There wasn't much to do except hit the diner or drive aimlessly through the countryside, windows rolled down, music blasting. Those drives were like therapy, a way to let our minds wander while we talked about everything and nothing at all. One particular night, Ethan had a suggestion. "Let's go to Thatcher Bridge," he said casually, as if he were suggesting grabbing a burger. Thatcher Bridge was an old iron structure that spanned a narrow creek about 5 miles outside of town. It wasn't on any major road, just a forgotten relic that connected two forgotten places. Locals whispered that it was haunted, but most of us wrote it off as a story to scare kids or keep teenagers from loitering. Supposedly, if you drove across the bridge at night, your car engine would shut off, leaving you stranded in the pitch-black darkness. I'd heard the stories growing up, but I'd never given them much thought. People love to exaggerate, especially in a town with not much else going on. Still, there was something about the idea that intrigued me. Maybe it was the challenge of disproving the legend. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something I knew I shouldn't. Or maybe it was just Ethan's infectious enthusiasm. We planned to head out that Friday night. By the time we got on the road, it was close to 11 p.m. The air was thick and humid, and the streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets. I remember checking the fuel gauge and thinking we were good for the night, with more than half a tank. It wasn't just Ethan and me that night. My younger brother, Tyler, had tagged along. He'd been pestering me for weeks to let him hang out with us, and this seemed like as good a time as any. Tyler was quieter than Ethan, more thoughtful and reserved, but he had a curiosity that matched ours. The drive to Thatcher Bridge took about 20 minutes. The further we went, the darker the roads became. Streetlights were sparse, and the only illumination came from the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the night. We passed fields, old barns, and the occasional house with its porch light on. Ethan was in the passenger seat, flipping through my old CD collection, while Tyler sat in the back, staring out the window. The atmosphere was lighthearted, filled with jokes and laughter, but there was also an underlying tension none of us wanted to acknowledge. When we finally reached the bridge, it felt like we'd crossed some invisible threshold into another world. The trees on either side of the road formed a dense canopy, blocking out what little moonlight there was. The bridge itself looked ancient, with rusted iron beams and wooden planks that creaked under the weight of the car as we rolled onto it. I stopped the car in the middle of the bridge, cutting the engine as Ethan had suggested. We sat there for a moment, enveloped in silence. The creek below us was barely visible, but I could hear the faint sound of water trickling over rocks. "All right," Ethan said, his voice tinged with both excitement and unease. "Let's see if this thing really shuts off the engine." I rolled my eyes, but played along, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life without a hitch. "See? It's just a stupid story," I said, trying to mask my relief. But Ethan wasn't convinced. "Let's wait a few minutes," he said. "Maybe it takes a little time." We waited. 1 minute turned into 5, and 5 turned into 10. Still, nothing happened. Just as I was about to declare the whole thing a waste of time, Tyler spoke up from the back seat. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" I asked, my tone more dismissive than I intended. "Listen," he said. I turned off the car radio and strained to hear what he was talking about. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, faintly, I heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like knuckles rapping against a wooden door. It seemed to echo all around us, impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. "All right, I've had enough of this," I said, turning the key in the ignition. The car sputtered but didn't start. I froze, my hand still on the key. "Try again," Ethan said, his voice tight. I turned the key once more, but the engine refused to catch. The tapping was louder now, almost deafening, and it was clear that whatever was making the sound was no longer outside the car. It was inside. For a few moments, none of us said a word. The rhythmic tapping seemed to reverberate inside the car, bouncing off the windows and walls as if we were trapped in some invisible bubble of sound. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening, and glanced at Ethan. His usual carefree smirk was gone, replaced by a look of uneasy curiosity. "Do you hear that?" I asked, though I knew they did. Tyler leaned forward from the back seat, his eyes wide. "It's coming from inside," he whispered. His voice was strained, barely audible, as if he were afraid speaking too loudly might provoke whatever was making the noise. Ethan turned to look over his shoulder, his movement stiff. "Is it the trunk? Maybe something's rolling around back there?" I shook my head. The sound wasn't metallic or random, it was deliberate, intentional. It was as though someone or something was knocking to get our attention. I twisted the key in the ignition again, this time with more force. The car sputtered and groaned, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The tapping grew louder, faster, and for the first time, I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "This isn't funny, man," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm not laughing," I shot back, my tone sharper than I intended. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. "Try the lights," Tyler suggested. "Maybe it's just the engine that's messed up." I reached for the switch and flicked it on. Nothing happened. The darkness outside the car was absolute, swallowing us whole. Even the faint glow from the dashboard seemed dimmer, as if the car itself was being drained of life. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. Before I could respond, the tapping abruptly stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete it felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. For a moment, I let myself hope that it was over, that the bridge's eerie reputation was just that, a reputation. But then Tyler let out a sharp gasp. "There's something outside," he whispered. Ethan and I turned simultaneously, our eyes darting to the windows. At first, I didn't see anything. The darkness was so thick it seemed almost tangible, like a curtain draped over the world. But then I saw it, a faint, flickering light moving in the distance. It was pale and unsteady, like the glow of an old lantern being carried through the woods. "Is that a flashlight?" Ethan asked, his voice a mix of relief and confusion. "Who would be out here this late?" Tyler counted, his tone laced with fear. The light grew closer, weaving slowly but purposefully toward the bridge. I couldn't make out a figure, but there was an undeniable sense of movement, as if whoever or whatever was holding the light was deliberately approaching us. "We should get out of here," I said, my voice firmer now. "And go where?" Ethan shot back. "The car won't start." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were stranded, sitting ducks on a bridge that was more legend than reality, with an unknown presence making its way toward us. "Maybe they can help," Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. I wasn't convinced either. Something about the way the light moved felt off. It wasn't hurried or erratic like you'd expect from someone trying to help. It was too steady, too deliberate, as if the person or thing holding it knew exactly what they were doing. "Lock the doors," I said suddenly, my voice low but firm. Ethan hesitated for a moment before reaching for his door and pressing the lock button. Tyler followed suit, and I did the same. The soft click of the locks engaged was the only sound in the car now. The light was closer now, close enough that I could see its reflection on the car's windshield. It stopped at the edge of the bridge, hovering there like it was waiting for something. My breath hitched as I strained to see who or what was holding it. But no matter how hard I looked, there was no silhouette, no shadow, nothing to suggest there was a person behind the glow. "Where's the person?" Tyler asked, his voice trembling. "There has to be someone there," Ethan said, though he didn't sound sure. The light suddenly went out, plunging us back into total darkness. "Okay, this is messed up," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I know," I replied, my throat dry. For a few moments, we sat there, paralyzed by fear. Then, without warning, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more frantic, like fists pounding against the glass. "It's on my side," Tyler screamed, pressing himself against the opposite door. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The window next to Tyler was fogged up, as if someone or something was breathing on it. And then, right before our eyes, a handprint appeared, slowly pressing against the glass from the outside. "Start the car," Ethan yelled. "I'm trying," I shouted back, twisting the key with all my strength. The engine sputtered and roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching as we sped off the bridge. The handprint on Tyler's window vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and the tapping stopped. But the sense of unease didn't leave us. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. When we finally reached the main road, I pulled over, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. "What the hell just happened?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. No one had an answer. We sat there for a long time, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd just experienced. The ride back to Ethan's place was quieter than it had ever been before. No music, no idle chatter, just the hum of the car engine and the occasional sniffle from Tyler, who had buried himself in the back seat. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel, my knuckles tight from gripping it so hard during the escape. None of us could shake the image of that handprint on the window, the way it had pressed itself firmly against the glass from the outside. "Do we talk about it or just pretend it didn't happen?" Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. I glanced at him. His normally confident demeanor seemed deflated, and I knew he wasn't just asking for conversation. He was looking for some kind of explanation, some assurance that what we had just experienced wasn't as bad as it felt. "We have to talk about it," Tyler said from the back seat, his voice muffled. That wasn't normal. None of it was. Ethan nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought about pulling into a nearby gas station just to get out of the car and stretch our legs. But something about stopping didn't feel right. I kept driving until we reached Ethan's place, where we finally piled out of the car and sat in his dimly lit living room. The weight of the experience hung heavy in the air as we recounted what had happened. "The light," I said, staring at my hands as I spoke. "It moved like it was looking for us. But there was no one holding it," Ethan added. "I swear I didn't see anyone. And the tapping," Tyler whispered, hugging a throw pillow to his chest. "It wasn't random. It was like it wanted us to notice." The room fell silent again. None of us wanted to say what we were all thinking, that the bridge was more than just some creepy local legend. "Do you think it was the bridge?" Ethan finally asked. I hesitated. "I don't know, but we weren't imagining it. We all saw the same thing." Tyler let out a shaky breath. "I'm not going back there. Ever. That should have been the end of it. We should have left it alone and gone back to pretending the world made sense." But something about the experience clung to me, a nagging itch in the back of my mind that refused to go away. Over the next few days, strange things started happening, small, unexplainable events that seemed to follow us like shadows. It began with my car. The morning after the incident, I went to start it, only to find that it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, which didn't make sense. I had replaced it less than 6 months ago. Ethan called me later that day, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Dude, I swear my phone keeps glitching. Every time I try to text you guys about what happened, it just freezes. Or the message deletes itself." Tyler chimed in during a group call that evening. "It's not just you. My TV turned itself on in the middle of the night. Static. Loud as hell. Scared me half to death." We laughed it off, trying to convince ourselves it was just coincidence. But deep down, we knew better. The events grew stranger as the week went on. Doors would creak open by themselves. Lights would flicker, even in broad daylight. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror, a faint shadow standing just behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep much that night. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Ethan and Tyler and told them we needed to figure out what was going on. Reluctantly, they agreed. We decided to start with the bridge. It was a stupid idea. We all knew it, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something unfinished. That if we didn't go back, the strange occurrences might never stop. We planned our return carefully. It was a Saturday evening, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time we reached the bridge, the world was shrouded in darkness once more. This time, we came prepared. Ethan brought a flashlight, Tyler had his phone's camera ready, and I carried a small toolkit in case the car acted up again. The bridge was just as we remembered it, long, narrow, and eerily quiet. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and stagnant water. As we stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaked beneath our feet, and a chill ran down my spine. "Let's not split up," Tyler said, his voice shaky. "Agreed," Ethan replied, holding the flashlight like a weapon. We walked slowly, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The beam of Ethan's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the planks ahead of us. At first, nothing happened. The bridge was just a bridge, a decaying relic of another time. But then, as we reached the center, the flashlight flickered. "Batteries dying?" I asked, though I knew it shouldn't be. "No, I just changed them," Ethan replied, shaking the flashlight. The light flickered again, then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, and the tapping started. This time, it was all around us, coming from every direction. The sound was louder than before, more frantic, as if whatever was making it was growing impatient. "Turn it back on," Tyler shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm trying," Ethan yelled, fumbling with the flashlight. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight app. The sudden beam of light cut through the darkness, but what it revealed made my blood run cold. Handprints. They were everywhere on the planks, on the railings, even on the air, as if invisible hands were pressing against an unseen barrier. "Oh my God," Tyler whispered. The tapping grew louder, more chaotic. And then we heard it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the depths of the river below. "We need to leave." "Now," I said, my voice firm. We turned and ran, the sound of our footsteps drowning out the tapping. As we reached the edge of the bridge, the moaning stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. When we finally made it back to the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. We piled in, and I started the engine. This time, it roared to life without hesitation. We didn't speak as I drove away, the bridge fading into the distance behind us. But the silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. It had been a week since our second visit to the bridge, and things had only grown worse. The strange occurrences followed us everywhere, shadows flickering in the corners of our rooms, whispered voices that seemed to come from nowhere, and the tapping sound that haunted us even in our dreams. Tyler had started sleeping with all the lights on, and Ethan refused to stay alone in his apartment. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stirred something we weren't meant to. It was Ethan who finally said it. We have to end this. Whatever is happening started with the bridge. We need to go back and, I don't know, confront it or something. Tyler was vehemently against the idea. Are you insane? Going back is what it wants. Don't you see that? It's trying to lure us there. Then what do you suggest? Ethan shot back. Just ignore it. Hope it goes away. It's not going away, Tyler. It's getting worse. I sat between them, my head pounding as they argued. I didn't want to go back, but Ethan was right. Whatever we were dealing with wasn't going to stop on its own. We go together, I said finally. We figure out what it wants, and we end it. Tyler groaned, burying his face in his hands. This is the dumbest thing we've ever done. You're not wrong, Ethan muttered. We chose a Friday night for our third and final visit. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and the wind howled as we drove to the bridge. This time, we came more prepared than before. Ethan brought salt, a crude nod to supernatural warding practices, while Tyler carried a crowbar, though none of us were sure what good it would do. I had printed out an old map of the area, hoping it might provide some clue about the bridge's history. The drive was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached the bridge, it was just as desolate as before, shrouded in an oppressive darkness that seemed almost alive. We stepped out of the car, our breaths visible in the freezing air. The bridge loomed before us, its wooden planks groaning in the wind. Let's get this over with, Tyler muttered, gripping the crowbar tightly. We walked onto the bridge, our footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The air felt heavier with each step, as if the bridge itself was resisting our presence. At the center of the bridge, we stopped. It was the same spot where the tapping had first started, where the flashlight had gone out, and where the handprints had appeared. What now? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I unfolded the map, my hands shaking. The map showed the area as it had been decades ago, and to my shock, the bridge wasn't there. Instead, there was a large lake, labeled simply as Deadwater Pond. This doesn't make sense, I said, holding the map up to the dim light of Ethan's flashlight. There shouldn't be a bridge here. This whole area used to be a lake. Before anyone could respond, the tapping started again. It was slow at first, coming from the far end of the bridge. But this time, it didn't stop. The sound grew louder and closer, echoing all around us until it felt like the very planks beneath our feet were vibrating. Okay, that's enough. We're leaving, Tyler said, turning back toward the car. But as he took a step, the tapping stopped. And then, the voice came. Stay! It was low and guttural, like the rumble of a distant thunderstorm. We froze, our breaths caught in our throats. The voice came again, louder this time. You came back. A cold wind swept across the bridge, and the air grew so frigid that frost began to form on the wooden railings. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and in its unsteady beam, we saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the bridge, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face. It didn't have a face, just a blank, smooth surface where its features should have been. Run, I whispered, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure began to move toward us, its steps slow and deliberate. The tapping sound returned, synchronized with its movement, as if its very presence was causing the bridge to groan in protest. Tyler screamed, dropping the crowbar and stumbling backward. Ethan grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. We have to do something, Ethan shouted. But what could we do? The figure was closing the distance, its blank face fixed on us. The air grew colder with each step it took, and I could feel my lungs burning with every breath. In a desperate act, I reached into Ethan's bag and grabbed the salt. I scattered it across the planks in front of us, forming a rough line between us and the figure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the figure stopped. The tapping ceased, and the bridge fell silent once more. The figure stood just beyond the line of salt, its head tilted as if studying us. Leave! The voice was a command, and this time we didn't hesitate. We ran. As we reached the car, I couldn't help but glance back. The figure was still standing there, watching us from the center of the bridge. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, even from a distance. When we finally piled into the car, I floored the gas pedal, not stopping until we were miles away. None of us spoke during the drive back. There was nothing to say, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. Not really. When we finally made it back to town, we didn't speak a word to each other. The silence in the car was suffocating, a shared understanding that whatever had happened on that bridge was far beyond our comprehension. Tyler sat slumped in the back seat, his crowbar abandoned somewhere on the bridge. Ethan gripped the dashboard with white-knuckled hands, staring blankly ahead as I drove. It wasn't until we pulled into Ethan's driveway that someone finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Tyler's voice was barely above a whisper, and he sounded as shaken as I felt. No one answered. What could we say? Call the police? They'd think we were insane. Tell someone else. Who would believe us? Ethan finally turned to me, his eyes hollow. "We can't just leave it like this." That thing, it spoke to us. It told us to leave, but it feels like it's not over. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The oppressive weight of the bridge lingered on us, even miles away. It was as if we brought a piece of its darkness with us. The next few days were a blur. We didn't talk about what had happened, but the tension between us was palpable. Tyler stopped coming over, saying he needed time to process. Ethan spent his nights researching everything he could about the bridge, Deadwater Pond, and the surrounding area. As for me, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its faceless form, standing motionless at the center of the bridge, the sound of its voice echoing in my ears. And then the shadows returned. At first, they were subtle, flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared the moment I turned to look. But soon, they became more persistent. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find my room plunged into an unnatural darkness, darker than any shadow should be. It wasn't just me. Ethan called one morning, his voice shaking. "It's here," he said. "I don't know how, but it followed me." He described the same shadows, the same oppressive feeling that had haunted me since we left the bridge. Tyler, too, started reporting strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, cold spots in his apartment, the sound of tapping at his windows late at night. We were being watched. It was Ethan who suggested we reach out to someone who might help. Through his research, he'd found an old local historian, Mr. Harlan, who specialized in the darker history of the area. Reluctantly, we agreed to meet him at a diner on the edge of town. Mr. Harlan was an older man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through us. When we told him about the bridge, his expression darkened. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said flatly. "Why?" Ethan pressed. "What's the story? What happened there?" Mr. Harlan leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. Deadwater Pond was drained decades ago. They built that bridge over the dried-up bed without knowing what they were disturbing. "Disturbing what?" Tyler asked, his voice trembling. "There are stories," Harlan continued, "about a man who lived by the pond. He was an outcast, shunned by the townsfolk. Some say he was accused of witchcraft. Others claim he was simply different. Whatever the case, the townspeople dragged him to the pond one night. They bound him and sank him into the water." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But he didn't drown. At least, not at first. Witnesses reported hearing tapping sounds from beneath the water for hours, like he was trying to claw his way out. When the sounds finally stopped, they assumed he was gone. But ever since, anyone who disturbs that area." He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the window. "Is cursed," Ethan finished, his voice barely audible. Harlan nodded. "Whatever you've awakened, it won't stop. Not until it gets what it wants." Harlan gave us one piece of advice: to return to the bridge and perform a ritual of release. According to him, The man's spirit was trapped, bound by the violence of his death. By acknowledging the wrong done to him and asking for forgiveness, we might be able to put him to rest. It sounded insane, but at this point, we were desperate. We gathered the items Harlan recommended: candles, an old iron key, and a small offering of food and water. As the sun set, we drove back to the bridge, our fear mounting with every mile. When we arrived, the air was colder than before, and the oppressive weight of the place was suffocating. We lit the candles, placing them in a circle at the center of the bridge. Ethan held the key, his hands trembling as he recited the words Harlan had written down for us. A plea for forgiveness, an acknowledgement of the pain and injustice inflicted on the man who had been drowned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the tapping started again. This time, it was all around us, echoing from the wooden planks, the railings, even the air itself. The candles flickered wildly, their flames nearly extinguished by the icy wind. And then, we heard the voice. "You cannot undo what was done." The figure appeared at the far end of the bridge, just as it had before. But this time, it didn't move toward us. Instead, it stopped at the edge of the circle of candles, its blank face staring down at the offering. For what felt like an eternity, the figure remained still. Then, it reached out with one impossibly long arm and touched the iron key in Ethan's hand. The tapping stopped. The wind died down. The oppressive weight lifted. And just like that, the figure was gone. We drove back in silence, too exhausted and shaken to speak. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. The shadows were gone, the tapping had ceased, and the oppressive feeling that had followed us since our first visit to the bridge had finally lifted. But I couldn't shake the memory of the figure's voice, the finality in its words. "You cannot undo what was done." Even now, I wonder if we truly ended it, or if we simply postponed the inevitable. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could after an experience like that. Ethan threw himself into his work, burying the memories in a relentless schedule. Tyler moved out of town, citing a new job opportunity, but I suspected he just wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and the bridge. As for me, I tried to move on, but some things are harder to shake than others. Nights were still uneasy. I'd often wake in the early hours, half expecting to hear that dreadful tapping or see shadows pooling in the corners of my room. Yet, nothing happened. The air in my home felt lighter, free of whatever oppressive presence had clung to us. Still, the bridge lingered in my mind. Sometimes, I'd catch myself driving past the turnoff to Deadwater Pond, my eyes lingering on the faded sign. I never stopped, but the pull was always there, as if some part of me wasn't ready to let it go. One evening, as I sat in a coffee shop downtown, I overheard a conversation at the next table. Two men were discussing the bridge. One of them mentioned strange occurrences, stories eerily similar to what we had experienced. "They say it's haunted," the man said, leaning in conspiratorially. "People hear tapping noises, see things that aren't there. My cousin swears his car stalled out right in the middle of it." My heart sank. Whatever we had done, it hadn't ended the curse. The bridge still held its grip, still drew in unsuspecting souls. I wanted to interrupt, to warn them, but what could I say? That I'd seen the faceless figure? That it had spoken to us, left a mark on our lives we could never erase? They'd laugh, dismiss it as another ghost story. So I stayed silent, sipping my coffee as their conversation drifted to lighter topics. As I drove home that night, I thought about what Mr. Harlan had said. You shouldn't have gone there. He was right. Whatever curiosity had drawn us to that bridge, it wasn't worth the price we paid. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder if we were meant to go there. If, somehow, we were part of the story now, connected to that place in a way we couldn't fully understand. The bridge wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a wound raw and festering, a reminder of an injustice that could never be undone. Perhaps our presence had stirred the waters, but the anger, the pain, had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. To this day, I avoid Deadwater Pond. I've moved out of the area, started fresh in a new city. But sometimes, when the nights are especially quiet, I hear the faintest sound of tapping. It could be the house settling or the wind against the windows. But deep down, I know the truth. The bridge isn't just haunted. It's alive, a place where the past refuses to stay buried. If you ever find yourself near Deadwater Pond, do yourself a favor. Stay away. Some stories aren't meant to be relived. Some shadows are best left undisturbed. And if you do go, if curiosity gets the better of you, don't say I didn't warn you. Now, turn off the lights, let the quiet settle around you, and try to sleep. But if you hear tapping in the night, don't look, because once you see it, you'll never unsee it. It all started in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where everyone knows each other's names, where the sound of children playing in the yard is common, and where neighbors wave as they pull out of their driveways. The streets were lined with modest homes, each one with its own story, but nothing ever felt out of the ordinary until one night, something changed. I'm an average guy living alone in a two-story home. At the time, I worked long hours as a graphic designer, mostly from home, with occasional trips to meet clients. The work was steady, and the routine was comforting. My days revolved around the usual coffee in the morning, a quick jog around the block, and then hours in front of my computer screen. Weekends were for chores or occasionally meeting up with friends. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable, just life as usual. But there was one thing that stood out: the deliveries. Living in a neighborhood where people often shopped online, packages arrived almost daily. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes they were for me, sometimes they weren't. A couple of times, I received a box that didn't belong to me, but I would simply leave it at the neighbor's doorstep with a note that said, "This is yours, I believe," and it would be gone the next day. The neighbors in the area were friendly, but not overly familiar. I'd say hello, share brief conversations, and that was about it. There was one neighbor, though, a middle-aged man named Tom, who had lived across the street for as long as I could remember. He was an odd fellow, kept to himself, didn't attend neighborhood gatherings, but always gave a polite nod when our paths crossed. His house was modest, nothing extravagant, and he had a reputation for being a bit of a recluse. It was just another evening when everything began to change. I had returned from my usual grocery run, carrying bags into the kitchen when I noticed a package sitting right on my porch. It wasn't unusual to see a package, but this one stood out. It had no label, no sender information, just a plain brown box with no indication of what it might contain. The oddest part, it was on my porch, despite the fact that I hadn't ordered anything recently. I thought maybe a neighbor had sent something to me by mistake, but I didn't recognize the handwriting on the note attached to the top of the box. "For you," it read in neat, cursive writing. That was it. No address, no clue as to who it was from. At first, I wasn't too concerned. I figured it was some sort of mistake, maybe a wrong delivery, and I planned to ask around the neighborhood the next day. I set it inside by the door, telling myself I would deal with it later. But a nagging feeling lingered in the back of my mind. Something about it didn't sit right. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, my thoughts swirling around the mysterious package. Why would it be delivered to my house? Why the cryptic note? As much as I tried to shake it off, I couldn't. The stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside my window. But something was off. Something felt wrong. The next day, I made my usual rounds grocery shopping, running errands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A sense of unease grew as the day wore on. I couldn't quite explain it. It wasn't just the package. It was the way the neighborhood felt, the quietness that now seemed too heavy, too suffocating. Something had shifted, and I couldn't pinpoint what it was. All I could think about was the package and the strange note that accompanied it. That evening, I took the box back outside, hoping that someone would come by and claim it. But when I stepped out, I was met with nothing. No cars in the street. No sounds of children playing. Just an eerie silence that seemed to echo through the air. I was alone, It was as if the world had become still for a moment, holding its breath. I placed the box back on the porch, debating whether or not I should open it. Part of me felt a strange pull, urging me to peek inside. But the other part, the part of me that trusted the normalcy of my life, fought against it. There was something unsettling about the whole thing. The box, the note, the way everything had suddenly become so quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of my old house, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. My mind kept returning to the box. It felt like it was calling to me, demanding my attention. But I didn't give in. Not yet. The following morning, I woke up early, groggy from another restless night. My usual routine kicked in. I brewed coffee, grabbed a quick bite to eat, and glanced over the day's tasks. As I made my way to the front door to head out for another round of errands, I froze. There it was again, the package. Right back where it had been the night before, waiting for me. No changes. Same plain brown box. The note, written in that same neat cursive script, remained attached. My stomach churned a bit. The sense of unease that had been creeping into my mind over the past 24 hours suddenly intensified. It didn't make sense. The package had been left on the porch the night before, and I had specifically placed it back outside, hoping someone would take it. But now it was there again, as if it had never moved. I bent down to pick it up, the odd weight of it making me pause for a moment. It was heavier than I remembered, and for a second I thought I felt a faint vibration, a subtle hum. I shook it off, thinking it was just my nerves. Maybe it was a prank. But who would go through the trouble of leaving a package on my porch for days with no explanation? I decided to finally open it. My curiosity got the better of me. With a sharp breath, I tore open the brown paper and peeled back the flaps of the cardboard box. Inside, there was something unexpected, something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a gadget or a gift as I had imagined. It was a stack of old, worn journals. The leather covers were scuffed and faded, and the pages inside had yellowed with age. There was no return address, no name, just these journals, and a single new note, handwritten in the same cursive. Start with the first one. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first journal. It looked ordinary enough, but something about it made my skin prickle. I flipped open the first page, not sure what I was expecting. It was a personal account, written in careful handwriting, and it started with a date, July 16, 1982. The entries were detailed, almost obsessively so, describing daily activities, feelings, and observations. But what caught my attention was the last entry. It was about a house. The entry described a house very similar to mine, in fact. It mentioned specific features, like the porch where the package had been left, the exact layout of the front yard, and even the neighbor across the street. The person writing the journal described these details with an unsettling sense of familiarity, as if they had been watching from the outside for years. I felt my heart race. How could someone know all of this? How could they have described my house, my street, and my life with such accuracy, even though the journal was written decades ago? Before I could process what I was reading, I heard a soft knock at the door. It was almost too quiet to hear over the pounding of my own heart. I froze, my hands still holding the journal. Slowly, I stood up, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that had settled into my bones. I approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. No one. I opened the door a crack, peering out. There was nothing. No delivery truck. No sign of anyone. The street was empty, just like it had been the night before when I had placed the package back outside. I stepped back inside, feeling a cold draft sweep through the room. The journal in my hand felt heavier, almost as if it were pulling me in. I glanced at the others still inside the box, stacked neatly, as if waiting for me to continue reading. But I couldn't. Not yet. I set the journal down on the table and took a step back, my mind racing. I needed to calm down. It was just a strange coincidence, right? Someone had sent these old journals, and maybe it was a mistake. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the whole situation became. How did they know about my house, my street, my neighbors? It felt too personal, too precise. I stood there in the middle of my living room, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I needed to talk to someone, but I didn't want to seem crazy. My phone was on the counter, and I stared at it for a moment. Who could I call? My neighbors. They probably wouldn't know anything. Tom, across the street, seemed like the type to keep to himself. I didn't even know if I trusted him to help me. As I paced, trying to gather my thoughts, I heard the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking just past my front door. I froze, listening intently. I waited for a moment, but when nothing happened, I crept over to the window and peeked through the blinds. Nothing. No one was there. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was just letting my imagination run wild. The wind must have caused some noise, or maybe it was just a neighbor walking by. But then, my phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. I grabbed it quickly, hoping it was a distraction from the thoughts that had been circling in my mind. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Are you reading the journals?" The message was short and to the point, sending a chill down my spine. How did they know? Who was this? I didn't reply. Instead, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the stack of journals on the table again, and then, without thinking, I grabbed the second one. The leather felt cold in my hands, the pages stiff as I opened it. The first page was almost identical to the first journal, but this one was dated August 5th, 1983. And then, it mentioned me. It didn't use my name, but it described me in such detail: my appearance, the way I moved, my habits, my routine. How could someone know all of this? My head was spinning. I needed answers, but the more I read, the more questions I had. Was I being watched? Had someone been following me for years? The air in the room felt heavier, thick with tension. I sat down on the couch, gripping the journal tightly, my eyes scanning the words. But all I could focus on was the sense of being trapped, as if I were being pulled into something far deeper than I could handle. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I slowly stood, setting the journal down, my legs shaking. I didn't want to answer it, but something told me I had no choice. I opened the door just a crack, enough to peer through. But there was no one. No package. No note. Nothing. Just the unsettling silence. The strange events began to increase with unnerving consistency over the following days. Each one built upon the last, an invisible thread tightening around me, pulling me deeper into a mystery I couldn't ignore. I could no longer chalk it up to coincidence or my overactive imagination. Something far more sinister was unfolding, and it was as if I were the last one to notice it. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when I walked outside, expecting to find nothing more than the usual quiet of my suburban neighborhood. But there, once again, was a package. The same plain brown box, resting on my porch as if it had been waiting for me to return. I nearly turned around, walked straight back into the house, and locked the door. But that would have been admitting defeat. I was already too far down the rabbit hole. I stared at it for a long moment, my thoughts racing. The notes had started days ago, each one more cryptic than the last. I had tried to dismiss the feeling of being watched, the eerie sensation that someone or something was observing me. But no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, the truth was clear. This was no ordinary package drop-off. Someone, somehow, was following me. I knelt to pick up the package, my fingers brushing the cardboard. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally, so a chill ran up my spine. The box didn't have the warmth of something that had been left out in the elements for hours. It was like it had been deliberately kept at a low temperature. Inside the box, there was no journal this time. Instead, there were old photographs, some in color, some in black and white. They looked like family pictures, smiling faces gathered around the dinner table, children running through a park, couples posing for vacations. But none of them were of me. They were pictures of people I had never met, places I had never been. I flipped through them, my heart pounding in my chest. What was the point of these? The photos seemed so random, so disconnected, but they all had something in common. They featured people staring directly at the camera, eyes wide open, expressions frozen in a way that felt too intense, too deliberate. It was as though they were trying to send me a message with just their gaze. But what message? The last photograph was the most unsettling. It was of my own house, taken from the street. It had been snapped late at night, the lights from my living room still glowing through the curtains. But the photograph wasn't clear. There was a faint blur in the corner of the image, as if something or someone had been caught in the frame just for a second before stepping out of view. I quickly set the photos down on the table and backed away. My mind spun with the possibilities, none of them pleasant. Who had been watching me? And why did they choose to send these pictures now, after everything that had already happened? I couldn't stay still for long. I needed answers. So I grabbed my phone, and after a deep breath, I dialed Tom. He was my only neighbor I still spoke to regularly, and I thought maybe he could offer some insight, or at least calm my nerves. "Hey, it's me. Got a minute?" I asked when he picked up. "Yeah, sure. What's up?" His voice was casual, unaffected. But the more I spoke to him, the more I could tell he wasn't fully listening. I explained the package situation, the notes, the journals, the photographs, and finally, the latest image of my house. "I don't know, man," he said after a long pause. "Sounds like you've been getting some weird deliveries. Maybe it's some kind of sick prank." "It's probably nothing. Just throw it out and forget about it." But I couldn't just throw it out. I needed to know who was behind this. And more than that, I needed to know why they were targeting me. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started with the cameras. I had a security system set up outside, primarily to monitor the driveway and front yard. I pulled up the footage from the past few days, watching with increasing anxiety as I rewound the footage to see when the packages had been delivered. The first video that caught my attention was from 3 days ago. The timestamp on the footage matched the night I had received the initial package. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the camera captured the figure of a person standing near my front porch. It was hard to make out much of the figure, just a shadow in a dark hoodie. The person was quick, moving with a deliberate slowness that seemed to match the rhythm of my own anxiety. I didn't see any identifying features, just the faint outline of someone bending down to leave the package and then disappearing back into the night. But that was just the beginning. The next video was even more unsettling. 2 days ago, at almost the exact same time, I watched the footage again. This time, the figure was clearer, almost too clear. It was as though the person had been standing there for far longer than the brief moments I had initially seen. They weren't just leaving packages. They were watching, standing completely still, as if waiting for me to react. I fast-forwarded through the footage, feeling my pulse quicken. Then I saw it. The figure didn't leave right away this time. They paused, turned, and walked toward the street. There was something so unnerving about the way they moved slow, deliberate steps, as if they were trying to stay out of sight, but still be aware of everything around them. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Was this person watching me in real time? Had they been waiting for me to discover their presence? What did they want? The next day, I started my own investigation. I walked through the neighborhood, asking around. At first, I thought I might get some answers from the people who lived nearby. I knocked on doors, inquiring if anyone had seen anything suspicious. No one had. They all seemed completely oblivious. It was as if no one else noticed the odd packages or the strange presence that had started to settle in. I started to realize that maybe I was the only one seeing what was happening. No one else had received mysterious deliveries. No one else had been targeted. It was as though someone was deliberately making me feel isolated, making me question my sanity. That evening, as I sat in my living room, going through the photos once more, I heard a soft tap against the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, more persistent this time. I turned toward the window, my breath catching. The blinds were closed, but the sound was unmistakable. Something or someone was on the other side. I rose from my seat, my body moving on its own, heart pounding as I approached the window. I slowly parted the blinds, trying not to make a sound. What I saw left me frozen in place. There, standing on my front lawn, was a figure. They were facing the window, staring directly at me. No movement, just the dark silhouette of someone in a hoodie, watching me, their eyes unblinking. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my chest. My hand reached for the phone on the table, but when I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. The yard was empty once again. I couldn't breathe. Every rational thought I had left my mind in that moment. What was going on? What had I gotten myself into? The investigation wasn't over. I had to keep going. But in that instant, I realized something. Whoever or whatever was behind this, they were getting closer. And there was no way to stop them. The following days felt like a slow descent into madness. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, every shadow lurking at the edge of my peripheral vision seemed like another omen. My once peaceful home had transformed into a prison, each package and cryptic note tightening its hold on me, pulling me deeper into this terrifying web. My mind was unraveling, and I couldn't tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. I couldn't take it anymore. I had been trying to carry on with my normal routine, going to work, running errands, but the unease followed me everywhere. It was like a dark cloud hanging overhead, blocking out the sun. The fear wasn't just in the quiet moments when I was alone. It was in every corner of my life. I had reached my breaking point. That night, as I sat in the living room, trying to collect my thoughts, I heard it again. A tapping sound, soft but distinct. I froze. It was coming from the back door this time. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, slowly making my way to the door. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, and swung it open. Nothing. The night air was cool and still, the darkness thick, but there was no one there. Just the usual quiet of the suburban neighborhood. I exhaled, half relieved, half terrified. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I had been so consumed by the paranoia that I had started imagining things. But then I saw it, a note, placed carefully on the doorstep. I hadn't heard it land. My stomach churned as I bent down to pick it up. The note was handwritten, scrawled in jagged, almost desperate writing. "The truth is right in front of you." The words burned into my mind. I had seen enough cryptic messages, enough unsettling deliveries, to know this was no coincidence. My heart was racing. Someone was toying with me. But why? Before I could process it, my phone rang. It was Tom. "Hey, it's me. I need you to come over now," he said, his voice filled with panic. "What's wrong?" I asked, suddenly on alert. "I don't know, man. Something's happening. You need to see it for yourself." His voice wavered, and I could hear the edge of fear in his tone. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, the cold night air biting at my skin. My heart pounded with every step as I made my way to Tom's house, the words on the note echoing in my mind. The truth was right in front of me. Was I finally going to uncover what had been happening all this time? When I arrived at Tom's, I didn't even bother to knock. I barged straight through the door, my mind racing. "What's going on?" I asked, looking around the dimly lit living room. Tom was standing by the window, his back to me. He didn't turn around. It's him," Tom said, his voice shaking. "He's outside watching." I didn't need any more explanation. I walked toward the window, my heart in my throat. I knew exactly what I would see before I even looked there. In the darkness was the figure. The same shadowed silhouette I had seen so many times before, standing just outside his house, motionless, staring directly at the window. But something was different this time. I could see him more clearly, his form more defined in the dim light. His face was barely visible, but I could make out the sharp features and the eerie, unsettling intensity in his eyes. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. This wasn't just some random person. It was him, the one who had been leaving the packages, the one who had been watching me, watching us. He had been here all along. "Call the police," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But as Tom grabbed his phone, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned away from the window and walked toward the street. My heart skipped a beat as I watched him retreat into the darkness, disappearing into the night as if he had never been there at all. "Did you see that?" I gasped. He was standing there, staring at us. Tom nodded, still pale. "I saw, but he's gone now." "What the hell is going on?" "We need to figure this out," I said, my mind spinning. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to come back. He's playing some kind of game with us." That was when it hit me, the truth that had been hiding right in front of me. This wasn't just a series of random events. The figure wasn't just a stalker. He was someone with a purpose, someone who had orchestrated every detail, every single package, every note. And the worst part, I had played right into it. I rushed to the door, grabbing Tom by the arm. "We need to go to my house. Now." We didn't speak as we made our way back to my place. The silence between us was thick with tension, both of us lost in our own thoughts. What was happening? Why me? Why Tom? And most importantly, who was this person, and what did they want? When we reached my front door, I didn't hesitate. I swung it open and stepped inside, Tom close behind me. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was then that I saw it. The package. It was sitting on the floor, directly in front of my door, as if it had been placed there just moments ago. But this time, something was different. The box was much larger than usual, its edges frayed as if it had been roughly handled. I bent down to pick it up, the familiar chill of dread creeping through me. As I pulled off the wrapping, I saw what was inside. A mirror. It wasn't an ordinary mirror, though. It was old, its edges tarnished with age, the glass warped and scratched. But what struck me the most were the words, written in thick, dark ink across the surface. "I see you." My heart stopped. The reflection staring back at me wasn't my own. It was the figure, the one who had been stalking me, watching my every move. His eyes were locked onto mine, his expression one of cold detachment. I staggered backward, my breath caught in my throat, the room spinning around me. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling. The answer came as the sound of a door creaking open behind us. I whipped around, my pulse racing. There, in the doorway, stood the figure. He was real. He was here. And now, there was no way out. His eyes, cold and lifeless, locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of his presence. It wasn't just the fear of being watched anymore. It was the overwhelming realization that I was no longer in control. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unseen pressure, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "Now, it's time for you to understand." The words echoed in my mind, and everything went black. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as if the very air in the room had been stolen from us. My mind was racing, my body frozen in place. I could feel Tom's presence behind me, the faint rustling of his movements, as if he too were struggling to breathe, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was as if everything around me had faded into nothingness. The cold, the dark, the weight of what was happening, all of it pressed in on me like a vice. His figure remained still, his face impassive, his gaze locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. I didn't know what to do. How could I fight something that felt so unnatural, so powerful? His presence felt like it was bending the very fabric of reality, distorting it in ways I couldn't understand. I could feel the edges of my sanity unraveling, piece by piece. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. Tom gasped behind me, his voice barely audible. "What do you want from us?" I could barely process the words. My throat felt like it had closed up, and I couldn't speak. I couldn't even scream. I could only stand there, paralyzed, waiting for whatever was coming next. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the folds of his coat, his hand emerging with a single, folded piece of paper. Slowly, methodically, he extended it toward me. The paper was old, worn, and stained with something dark. My fingers shook as I reached for it, the weight of the moment making every movement feel slow and deliberate. As I unfolded the paper, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread creep over me. The note was covered in the same jagged handwriting I had seen before, but this time the message was longer, more personal. You have come this far, but you still don't understand. You were never meant to escape. The game was never meant to be won. You are part of something bigger now. The truth you seek is right before you, but it will never be enough. You will never be free. I felt my stomach turn. The words were like a punch to the gut, each line sinking deeper into my soul. There was no answer in this note, no resolution, just more cryptic taunts. I looked up at the figure, hoping to see something, anything that would give me a sense of closure. But he stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. "Why?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a low, rasping voice. "It's not about what I want," he said, his tone sending a shiver down my spine. "It's about what you want, what you've always wanted, and what you will never get." His words stung like ice, each syllable biting into me. It was as if he knew everything about me, about us. Everything that we had hoped for, everything we had worked for. And now, standing there, he had taken it all away. Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows, as if he had never been there at all. For a moment, neither Tom nor I moved. We stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The room felt unbearably still, the air thick with a lingering dread. It was as though time itself had stopped. There was no sound, no wind, no traffic, no voices, just the echo of his last words reverberating in my mind. "What the hell just happened?" Tom finally whispered, his voice cracking. "Who was he?" I shook my head, feeling as if the ground beneath me had disappeared. I wanted to scream, to rage against whatever force had pulled us into this nightmare, but I couldn't. All I felt was emptiness, as if all the life had been drained from me in that single moment. I looked down at the note in my hands, my fingers trembling. The words still burned in my mind, like an image seared into my memory. "You will never be free." What did that mean? Was I trapped? Was there no escape from this madness? Tom moved toward the door, his steps hesitant but determined. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." But where would we go? What would we do? I had no answers, no solutions. All I had was the overwhelming sense that whatever had just happened wasn't over. I followed Tom out of the house, the darkness of the night swallowing us as we stepped into the quiet street. The wind had picked up, a cold breeze brushing against my skin, but it did little to shake the chill that had settled deep within me. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, suffocating me with its uncertainty. We didn't speak as we walked, the distance between us filled with 1,000 unasked questions. What was this figure? What did he want? Was it over, or was it just the beginning of something worse? We reached Tom's car, and I slid into the passenger seat, the familiar hum of the engine doing little to comfort me. As we drove away from my house, the lights of the city grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. But no matter how far we went, no matter how much distance we put between us and that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there. That whatever had happened, whatever we had just experienced, was far from over. The road ahead seemed endless, but I knew that no matter how far we drove, no matter where we went, I would never be free of what had happened. The figure had been a part of it, but it was more than just him. It was everything: the packages, the notes, the sense of being watched, it all tied together into something I couldn't quite understand. When I closed my eyes that night, lying in bed, I could still see his eyes, staring back at me from the mirror. And no matter how hard I tried to shake the image, I knew it would haunt me forever. The truth was right in front of me, but I would never be able to fully grasp it. The game had been played, and I was still left with unanswered questions, trapped in the aftermath of something I couldn't escape. I had no choice but to live with it. The days that followed were marked by a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Tom and I kept in touch, but even his calls seemed distant, as if neither of us could fully commit to the reality of what had happened. We'd spoken briefly about the figure, the cryptic notes, and the strange presence in my house, but each conversation only seemed to open new doors in our minds, doors that neither of us could bear to open completely. I spent my time in a daze, trying to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. Nothing was normal anymore. I tried to return to my usual routine, working, meeting friends, living the life I had before, but nothing felt right. Each knock at the door made my heart skip a beat, and every car that slowed down in front of my house made my skin crawl. There were times when I'd look out the window, convinced that I'd see him again standing there, watching me, waiting for the next move. But nothing ever came. I never saw him again. Not once. At first, that brought a small sense of relief, but it didn't take long for that relief to turn into doubt. It was as if the figure was still out there somewhere, just beyond my reach, playing a game that I couldn't understand. What was it all for? Why had he come to my house, left those notes, and then disappeared without a trace? The questions swirled in my mind, growing more insistent with each passing day. What did the note mean when it said I would never be free? Was I just supposed to live with this haunting, knowing that it could come back at any moment? Was the figure just a shadow, a manifestation of something darker? Or was he something real, something capable of truly pulling me into this game? I couldn't stop thinking about the words he had left behind. They echoed through my mind like a constant, gnawing ache. You will never be free. No matter how much time passed, I couldn't escape it. The fear, the uncertainty, it stayed with me. Even now, when I try to go about my day, when I try to leave the past behind, the memory of that night lingers like a shadow over everything. And maybe that's what he meant. Maybe the figure didn't need to be present for me to be haunted. Maybe the real terror was not in what he did, but in the knowledge that I would always carry it with me. I found myself staring into mirrors more often than I cared to admit. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection and wonder if he was watching me from somewhere within it. His eyes, cold and calculating, always seemed to be there, waiting for me to slip up, to give in to the madness. Every reflection became a reminder that I was being watched, whether I knew it or not. That feeling of being trapped, of having no way out, never left me. In the midst of all this, I couldn't help but reflect on what had really happened that night. It wasn't just the figure, the strange deliveries, or the unsettling notes that scared me. It was what they represented, how small and insignificant I felt in the grand scheme of it all. It was as if I had stumbled into something bigger than myself, something that had been going on long before I even realized it. There were forces at work, hidden things that I could never understand. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't matter how hard I tried to escape. The game was never meant to be won. I was never meant to walk away. Tom and I eventually lost contact. It wasn't a dramatic farewell, just a slow fading away, like two people drifting apart after a shared experience that neither one of them could truly understand. We both had our lives to live, and the weight of what had happened was too heavy to carry around together. We tried to keep in touch, but the conversations grew fewer and farther between. I think we both knew there was nothing left to say. In the end, I was left to deal with it on my own. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of it all. Because no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was over, I knew deep down that it wasn't. The notes, the deliveries, the cryptic messages, they weren't just random events. They were part of something larger. And though I had never seen the figure again, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was still in the game. I was still being watched, still being pulled deeper into whatever this was. I'll never have answers. I'll never know why it happened, or what the figure wanted, or what his final message meant. But there's something in those unanswered questions that gnaws at me, something that keeps me up at night. Because I know one thing for sure. Whatever happened that night wasn't just a story. It was real, and it left a scar that I don't think will ever fully heal. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the figure wasn't trying to hurt us or trap us in some kind of twisted game. Maybe he was just showing us the truth, the uncomfortable, terrifying truth that we're all part of something we can't control, something we can't escape. In the quiet moments, when I'm alone and the world feels still, I sometimes hear a knock at the door. It's not loud, but it's there, soft, insistent, like a reminder that the game isn't over. Maybe it never will be. So, as I close my eyes tonight, I can't help but wonder, what if he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next move? Maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. And perhaps, just perhaps, I will never be free. At the time, I worked at a small tech firm in a city that was busy, noisy, and full of life. The kind of place where the bustle of traffic and the hum of conversation are constant, almost blending into the background. Most days, you'd find me at my desk, typing away on my laptop, responding to emails, and attending endless virtual meetings. The office was full of people, but the air was often quiet, the soft clacking of keyboards filling the space. A typical office environment, nothing out of the ordinary. The office was nestled on the 5th floor of an old building in the heart of the city. It wasn't much to look at gray walls, fluorescent lights, and old cubicles that were filled with more paperwork than I cared to count. But it was a job, and I got used to the predictable rhythm of the day. My coworkers were a mix of personalities. Some, like me, kept to themselves, while others liked to talk and laugh together. There was Jake, a guy who always brought in strange coffee concoctions, and Maria, who had a knack for organizing everything to perfection. We were all just going through the motions, trying to get through the workday, dreaming of the weekend. And then there was the copy machine. It sat in the corner of the office, an old model that had seen better days but still worked just fine. Most days, it was nothing more than a tool to print reports, copies of contracts, and all the mundane tasks you could expect from an office job. People would use it to print out presentations or scan documents. No one paid much attention to it, except when it jammed, which, with its age, happened more than I cared to admit. It was just another Thursday when things started to feel off. I had been sitting at my desk for hours, sifting through emails and working on a presentation. The office was mostly quiet, aside from the soft murmur of conversations here and there. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, creating a constant background hum. I glanced at the clock, almost time for lunch. The usual lunchtime chatter began to fill the space, but something caught my attention. The sound of the copy machine. It wasn't the usual sound of paper being fed into the machine, but a different noise, a series of soft clicks followed by a hum. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, this machine was old and often made strange noises. But then, as I returned to my work, I heard it again. Another set of clicks, followed by the unmistakable sound of paper sliding through the printer. But here's the thing, it wasn't printing anything I had asked it to print. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, a glitch. Maybe someone had left a document in the machine, and it was just printing out something random. I figured I'd see what was on the paper once it came out. But when the page finally ejected, I was taken aback. It wasn't a blank sheet. It wasn't a report. It was a message. A message that I hadn't typed. It read, "Do you remember what you did?" Confusion set in. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the machine with cautious steps. There was no one else around, and it didn't make sense. The machine was printing something, but no one had been near it. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be playing a joke on me, but everyone was at their desks, focused on their work. I picked up the paper, turned it over, and checked the back. Nothing. Just the words. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was it some sort of error? Maybe someone had sent something to the printer without realizing it? But that didn't explain the message. It didn't make sense. I shook my head and returned to my desk, trying to push it out of my mind. But as I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A chill ran down my spine, and I found myself glancing over at the machine every so often, wondering if it would print something again. It wasn't long before I heard the machine hum to life once more. I stood up again, this time with a sense of urgency, and walked over to it. I had to see what it was printing. The paper slid out once again. I reached down and snatched it, my heart racing as I unfolded the sheet. This time it read, "You're not alone." I froze. What the hell was going on? There was no one else around the machine. No one had come near it. Yet there it was, another message, printing on its own. I looked over at my coworkers. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. The office had returned to its usual rhythm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tucked the paper into my drawer, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. Maybe it was a prank, I thought. Maybe someone had set it up somehow. But why? And how? The questions flooded my mind, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. As the day wore on, I couldn't help but keep glancing over at the copy machine. What if it printed again? What if it printed something even more unsettling? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus. Every time I heard the hum of the machine, I tensed up. But nothing more happened that day. The office returned to its normal rhythm, and the copy machine seemed to go back to its usual routine. By the time I left that night, the paper with the strange messages was still in my drawer, unopened, as though it was just waiting for me to figure it out. As I walked out of the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But who was watching me? The next day, the office seemed like any other. The familiar faces, the same buzz of keyboards and muffled conversations, the clinking of coffee mugs being set down, nothing seemed out of place. But something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but that strange feeling from yesterday lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. I couldn't shake the memory of the messages. What had happened? It didn't make sense. The copy machine was still there, sitting quietly in the corner of the office. And for the most part, it looked like any other office machine, unassuming, nothing to draw attention. But in my mind, I couldn't look at it the same way anymore. It felt different, and every time I passed by it, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to focus on work, pushing the strange events to the back of my mind. I wasn't going to let it distract me. But as the morning wore on, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The office printer had started making that same strange clicking sound again. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of the usual office noise. But it was there, like a quiet whisper that grew louder, pulling my attention away from my work. I looked up from my desk and saw the machine whirring slightly, as if it was about to print something. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just another glitch, a paper jam, or a weird sound from an old machine. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of paper sliding through the printer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze. The machine had printed something, but there was no one around. No one had used it. No one had walked by it. I hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked over to the printer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached, I could see a fresh sheet of paper hanging out of the machine, ready to be pulled out. I reached forward slowly, my hand trembling slightly, and grabbed the paper. I unfolded it, my fingers feeling strangely cold as I looked down at the words printed on the page. It said, "Stop looking at me." I stood there, staring at the paper, my mind racing. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a simple glitch. Whoever or whatever was behind this, it wasn't something I could easily explain away. I looked around the office, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching me, but there was no one. Everyone was absorbed in their own work, none the wiser to what was happening. The office hummed along, oblivious to the unsettling incident unfolding in the corner. I couldn't focus. My mind raced, replaying the events from the day before the first message, the feeling of being watched, and now this. It wasn't just random. It couldn't be. The strange occurrences felt too deliberate, too personal. But I didn't know who to turn to. Who would believe me? I went back to my desk, the paper still clenched in my hand. I shoved it into my drawer, hoping it would disappear, as if putting it away would make it all go away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop. As the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I caught myself glancing over at the copy machine every few minutes, wondering if it would start printing again. I wasn't sure if I wanted it to, or if I was just too scared to find out. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was overreacting. After all, there had to be a logical explanation for all of this, right? But when the copy machine made that clicking sound again, I couldn't ignore it. This time, I didn't wait to see what it would print. I rushed over to the machine, my pulse quickening. I pulled out the paper the moment it slid through, and my hands shook as I unfolded it. The words on the page were the same as before, except now they seemed even more chilling. "You can't stop me." I stood there, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. There was no way this was just a coincidence. There was something going on with the machine, something unnatural. I looked around, desperate for someone to share my confusion and fear, but no one seemed to notice. Maria was at her desk, absorbed in her own work. Jake was chatting with a coworker in the far corner of the office. No one seemed to care about the strange occurrences happening right under their noses. I looked at the paper in my hands, feeling a growing sense of dread. I shoved it back in the drawer with the first message, hoping that if I kept it hidden, it would all go away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. By now, I was certain that something was wrong. Something far beyond a malfunction or a prank. The copy machine was printing messages that no one had typed. It was as though the machine had a mind of its own, a purpose that no one could understand. And it wasn't done yet. That afternoon, as the office continued its routine, I heard the familiar sound of the copy machine whirring to life again. This time, it was louder, more pronounced. The clicking grew faster, like the machine was eager to spit out whatever it had to say. I could feel the tension building in my chest as I walked toward it. I wasn't sure what I would find this time. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. But I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the paper from the machine, almost afraid to look at it. And when I unfolded it, I gasped. This time, the message was different. It wasn't a sentence. It wasn't even words. It was a drawing. A crude sketch of a face. A face that looked disturbingly familiar. It was my face. I stared at it, my mind going blank. My heart pounded in my chest. How? How was this possible? The drawing was crude, hastily done, but it was undeniably me. My features, my expression, everything about it was too perfect, too accurate, and it terrified me. I felt as though I was being watched, as though someone or something was following my every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. I looked around the office again, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone continued with their work, just like before. No one saw what I had seen. No one was aware of the machine's eerie behavior. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. What was happening to me? What was happening to the office? And what in the world was controlling that machine? I didn't know the answers. All I knew was that I had to figure this out before it was too late. The following days felt like a blur. The messages from the copy machine kept coming, and with each new sheet of paper, the sense of unease only grew stronger. I found myself checking the machine more frequently, my steps hesitant, as if I could somehow anticipate what would print next. But no matter how many times I approached the machine, each new message felt like a blow to my sanity. There was no escaping it. It wasn't just the messages. It was the way the air around the machine seemed to change, like a subtle shift in temperature, a heaviness that settled in the pit of my stomach. Every time I passed the machine, I could feel it calling to me, pulling my attention, as if it were alive and watching me. The machine had become a constant presence, an ominous force that I couldn't ignore. One morning, I walked into the office earlier than usual. The lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow across the room. The hum of the copy machine was the first thing I noticed, but it wasn't the usual low whirring sound. It was louder, more insistent, as if the machine was demanding something from me. I walked over to it slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The display was dark, as it always was when no one was using it. But I could feel the tension in the air, a tangible weight that pressed down on me. I didn't want to look at the machine, didn't want to know what it had printed, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the drawer where the paper always came out, my hand trembling as I pulled out the sheet. As I unfolded it, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It was another drawing. This time, it wasn't just my face. The image was a twisted version of myself, distorted, like a nightmare, with wide, unblinking eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The longer I looked, the more it felt like the drawing was mocking me, like it knew something I didn't. I shoved the paper into my desk drawer, trying to force my mind away from the image, but the picture lingered, like a ghost haunting the corners of my thoughts. As the days wore on, I noticed that the messages were becoming more frequent, more aggressive. The drawings had started to evolve, taking on an almost lifelike quality. One afternoon, I found a message waiting for me when I returned from lunch. I didn't even have to approach the machine. I could see it from across the room. The sheet of paper was hanging halfway out, the words stark and clear. "You are mine." My stomach churned. The words weren't just eerie, they were personal. It felt as though the machine was speaking directly to me, a sinister invitation to a game I didn't want to play. I stood frozen in place, staring at the paper, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to figure out what was happening, and fast. I wasn't sure who to turn to. No one seemed to notice what was going on. Everyone was too wrapped up in their own routines, too focused on their work to see the strange events unfolding in front of their eyes. I couldn't expect anyone to understand. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might be the only one who was seeing this. I started keeping a log. Every time the machine printed something, I would write it down, documenting the time, the message, and any details I could think of. But no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, there was no pattern, no reason behind the madness. The messages were random, cryptic, and terrifying. But then, one evening, something happened that made my blood run cold. It was just after the office had cleared out for the day. The lights were dim, and the quiet hum of the machines was the only sound that filled the air. I was sitting at my desk, still going through emails, when I heard the distinct sound of the copy machine starting up. I froze. I hadn't used the machine, and no one else was around. But there it was, the unmistakable sound of the printer coming to life. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew something was wrong, but this was different. This time, I wasn't going to let the machine dictate the terms. I walked over to it, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the machine, I saw the paper already emerging. I grabbed it, not bothering to wait for it to finish printing. As I unfolded the sheet, my breath caught in my throat. This time, there were no words, no drawings, just a photograph. A photograph of me. It was a picture I didn't recognize. It was taken from a distance, a snapshot of me walking across the office, my back turned, oblivious to whoever was watching me. The quality was poor, grainy, like it had been taken with an old camera. But what made it so terrifying was the fact that it was taken when I hadn't noticed anyone around. No one had been there. Someone had been watching me. I stared at the photo for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind was reeling. How had this happened? Who was taking these pictures? How was it possible that the copy machine, of all things, was printing these intimate, disturbing images? I couldn't just stand there and let it happen again. I had to act. But what could I do? The machine was doing something it shouldn't be able to do, printing messages and images that no one had inputted. It was like it had a mind of its own, an intelligence beyond anything I could explain. I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I waited for the others to leave the office. Then I made my move. I was going to find out what was behind this madness, no matter the cost. I pulled the machine apart, piece by piece. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to start somewhere. I expected to find something, a glitch, a malfunction, maybe even a hidden camera. But what I found was nothing short of horrifying. There was no hidden device, no wires out of place. But as I lifted the cover, something caught my eye. A small, faint symbol was etched into the metal beneath the printer's surface. It was barely visible, but it was there, an odd symbol, like a combination of runes, scrawled in dark ink. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it. I had no idea what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was behind this, it wasn't something simple. I wasn't dealing with a malfunction anymore. I was dealing with something far worse. It was a Saturday evening, the office nearly deserted, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of a chair as I paced the room. I had spent the last few days obsessively trying to piece together what was happening, but every time I felt like I was getting closer to the truth, the situation would escalate even further. After discovering the strange symbol beneath the machine, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to research it, but found nothing. No reference, no meaning. It was as though the symbol itself was not from any world I knew, like it didn't belong. The unease that had been growing inside me blossomed into something far more terrifying. Something beyond my comprehension was happening. I walked into the office with the same tension that had become so familiar in the last few weeks, but tonight felt different. It was as though the air itself had thickened with anticipation, almost as if the walls were holding their breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would finally answer all the questions I had been asking. The copy machine stood silently in the corner, looking eerily calm. But it wasn't just the machine that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the stillness of the room, the emptiness, the sense that I wasn't alone. I approached the machine slowly, each step a battle against the overwhelming instinct to run. The room seemed to get colder with every inch I drew closer, my breath becoming visible in the dim light. I had never noticed the temperature drop like this before. The fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering as if they were struggling to stay on, and the machine's quiet hum filled the silence like an ominous whisper. As I stood in front of the machine, I took a deep breath. I had to know what was going on. I had to confront this thing head on, no matter what it cost me. My hands trembled as I reached for the machine's control panel, pressing the button to start a copy. The machine whirred to life, its sound cutting through the silence like a blade. I waited. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. A message? A drawing? But the paper that slowly began to emerge was different from the rest. It wasn't just words or images. It was a video, a moving image printed onto the paper. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the image was still there, an unsettling, distorted version of myself standing in the corner of the room, facing the machine, but with my back turned. I stood frozen, staring at the paper, my mind racing. How was this even possible? It wasn't a still photo. It was moving, like a ghostly loop of my own image, captured and printed by a machine that shouldn't even be capable of such a thing. The figure in the image twisted, distorting, flickering like a malfunctioning television screen. And then it spoke. "Why won't you look at me?" The voice wasn't my own. It wasn't human at all. It was cold, hollow, as though it came from a place beyond sound, from some far-off, empty space. My blood ran cold as the words echoed in the room. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the paper. The figure in the image began to move closer to the camera, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was like something trying to crawl its way out of the very fabric of reality. And then, in one swift motion, the figure lunged at the lens, its hands outstretched, its face contorted in a horrific scream. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, and the room felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I turned to run, but something stopped me. The machine. It was still printing. More sheets of paper poured out, one after another, faster than I could comprehend. Each sheet held the same moving image, each one more grotesque than the last. The figure in the images began to multiply, surrounding me. They were closing in on me, all of them stretching out their arms toward me, their mouths open, silent screams emanating from their twisted faces. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me, but the images kept coming, faster and faster. It felt like they were alive, like they were trying to pull me into the machine itself. I couldn't escape. Then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. The machine fell silent. The lights flickered back to their normal, steady glow. The room seemed to exhale, the tension breaking in an instant. The images, the twisted faces, the screams, they were gone. The machine was quiet. Everything was still. I stood there, my body rigid, heart racing, unable to move. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew I had come face to face with something beyond my comprehension. It wasn't just a haunted machine. It was a doorway, a portal to something far darker than I had imagined. And then I heard something, a soft click, like a button being pressed. I turned toward the source of the sound, and to my horror, I saw the paper tray of the copy machine slide open again. Another sheet of paper was emerging. I walked toward it, unable to stop myself. As I reached for the paper, my hand trembling, I noticed that the sheet was different from the others. It was blank. For a moment, I felt a brief sense of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the nightmare was finally finished. But then, I saw it. In the center of the blank sheet was a single word, scrawled in red ink, as if written by a hand that wasn't mine. Run! The word burned itself into my mind. I looked up from the paper, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I noticed something in the corner of the room, a shadow. A dark, moving shape that was neither part of the room nor of this world. It was watching me. I ran. I didn't stop running. My legs felt like they were on fire as I sprinted through the office hallways, the sound of my own frantic breathing echoing in my ears. I didn't care about anything anymore, the unanswered questions, the strange happenings, the figure in the paper. All I cared about was escaping. I burst through the back exit, the cool night air hitting me like a wall. I didn't slow down, didn't look back. I just kept running, feeling the ground beneath me, the rhythm of my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. I needed to get away, to leave the office building behind, to put as much distance between me and that cursed machine as possible. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. The images, the messages, the cold hand of something not quite human reaching out from the machine. It was too much to process all at once. I wanted to forget. I wanted to tell myself it had all been a nightmare, some cruel trick played on my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. It had been real. Too real. I eventually found myself standing outside in the empty parking lot, gasping for air, my eyes scanning the dimly lit spaces around me. The cool breeze helped clear my head, but the dread still weighed heavily on my shoulders. I wanted to leave, to drive far away, but something told me that no matter where I went, the machine would find me. That whatever this was, it wasn't just tied to the office. It was tied to me now, and I couldn't escape it. The next morning, I didn't return to work. I couldn't bring myself to go back. I knew I had to, but the thought of facing that machine, of standing in the same room where it had all happened, was unbearable. Instead, I sat at home, replaying every detail over and over in my mind. The figure in the images, the haunting messages, the cold, empty voice. I tried to tell myself it was some sort of elaborate prank, that it couldn't be real, but deep down, I knew better. I spent the next few days trying to reach my coworkers. I needed answers. I couldn't do this alone, but no one picked up. Everyone was unreachable. As the days passed, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. It wasn't just the machine that had changed things. Something in the air had shifted, and I could feel it, a subtle unease that clung to every moment, every sound. I was being watched. I was sure of it. On the fourth day after the incident, I got a call. It was from an unknown number. My heart raced as I answered it, but there was no voice on the other end. Only static. It crackled in the silence, and then, through the noise, came a voice I had heard before. "Why won't you look at me?" I froze. The same chilling, hollow tone from the machine. The words sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. I slammed the phone down. My breath ragged as I stared at it, willing it to stop ringing. The calls kept coming, one after another, at all hours of the day and night. Each time, it was the same voice, the same words. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. It was as though the machine had somehow reached out beyond the walls of that office and was pulling me back in, dragging me deeper into its dark grip. The messages began to change. At first, they were just words, simple, cold sentences. But then, they started to include more than just words. I would get photos, images of myself, distorted and warped, each one showing me from different angles, as though the machine was watching me, studying me. Each image was more unsettling than the last. One day, I received a message that was unlike anything I had gotten before. It wasn't a call or an image. It was a video. I hesitated for a long time before watching it. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it was something important. Something that would finally answer my questions, or at least, I hoped it would. The video began with a shaky, out-of-focus shot of the office building. It looked exactly like it had the night I left, but something was off. The lights flickered in a way that was unnatural, and the shadows stretched too long, as though they were alive. The camera zoomed in slowly on the back entrance, the place where I had escaped from. And then, just as the video seemed to stabilize, it cut to something else, something far more horrifying. It was the copy machine. It was on, as though it had been waiting for me. But this time, the paper tray was empty. And in the center of the machine, there was something else, something I couldn't quite make out. A dark shape, a figure, just barely visible in the dim light. And then it spoke. "Come back." The voice was faint but unmistakable. I dropped the phone, my body trembling as the words echoed in my mind. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave it all behind, but I knew I couldn't. That's when I realized that there was no escaping. No matter how far I ran, the machine would always find me. It was already inside me, in my mind, in my thoughts, in my very being. I decided then that I had to go back to the office, confront whatever had been waiting for me there, and end it. Whatever this was, whatever force had taken hold, it wasn't going to let me go until I faced it head on. I gathered the courage to return to the office that night. The building was dark, just as I had left it, but this time, the silence felt oppressive. I walked through the hallways, every step echoing like a death knell, the air thick with the feeling that something was watching me. The copy machine sat in the corner of the room, still and silent. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. I approached the machine slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The screen flickered, and then the familiar words appeared. "Why won't you look at me?" I stared at the message, my hands shaking. I knew this was it, the final confrontation. I had to face whatever it was that had been haunting me. The machine beeped again, and a sheet of paper emerged. It was blank. But as I stared at it, the letters began to form, slowly at first, and then faster. "You belong to me now." I backed away, feeling the walls closing in around me. The room felt colder, the shadows lengthening as though they were reaching for me. And then, for the briefest moment, everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer in the office. I was sitting in my car, the engine running, parked at the edge of the parking lot. The moonlight bathed the empty building in an eerie glow. I couldn't explain how I had gotten there, or how much time had passed. But the machine was still there, waiting. I didn't return. I couldn't. Something had changed inside me. The connection, the pull, was still there, but I knew it would be futile to try and stop it. Whatever had started that night had already claimed me. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the machine was still watching me, that it was still calling me, somewhere in the dark. It's been months since I last set foot in that office. And yet, every time I close my eyes, I feel like the machine is right there, watching me, calling me. I can't escape the sense that it's not just in the building, or even in the copy machine. It's everywhere. It's inside me now, buried deep under my skin, in the back of my mind, always waiting. I still get the occasional call, never during the day, but always at night, when the world is still and the silence is deafening. The voice still whispers those same words, a cold reminder that I will never truly be free. Why won't you look at me? I never answer anymore. There's no point. I know what it means. It's calling me back, trying to draw me into its web once again. And I won't go. I can't. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in a quiet room, alone with my thoughts, I wonder if I'm still running from it, or if I've simply given in to its call. I wonder if, by avoiding it, I'm just feeding into its control. I've tried to talk to people about what happened. My friends, my family, they listen, but they don't understand. They can't see what I see. They don't feel the cold weight pressing down on them, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. They don't hear the whispers in the dark. And every time I bring it up, I see the skepticism in their eyes, the way they nod and smile, trying to placate me. I don't blame them. How could they understand? There's only one person who I think might know. The security guard from the building. The one who'd always been there when we worked late. The one who saw me leave the night of the incident. He's an older guy, quiet, keeps to himself. But I remember something strange about him. After everything happened, after I quit the job and disappeared, he reached out to me. One night, when I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the same blank walls that I'd stared at for weeks, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a single piece of paper inside. It was a photograph. A grainy, black and white shot of the copy machine in the office, sitting in the corner of the room, under the dim, flickering lights. But there was something different about this photo. Something I hadn't seen before. The figure, the dark shape in the machine was clearer now, standing out against the dim background. And in the background of the photo, a faint silhouette of person standing behind the machine, their face obscured in shadow. The message was simple. It's not over. I didn't know what to make of it. My first thought was to burn the letter, to erase it from my life, as though it were just another nightmare. But something stopped me. It was like the machine had already made its mark on me, and no matter how much I tried to run, it would always be there, lingering just beneath the surface. I thought about that letter for weeks. It kept me up at night, gnawing at me, pulling me back into the dark corners of my mind. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was just some sick joke, that the security guard had nothing to do with it. But deep down, I knew that the machine wasn't finished with me, that it had somehow followed me, attached itself to my soul, and wouldn't let go. The truth is, I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know if I'll ever be free from it. The machine might be gone, but its hold on me lingers, creeping into my thoughts, taking over my every waking moment. There's no escaping it. Not for me. Not now. Maybe the scariest thing of all isn't the machine itself. It isn't the dark figure in the copy tray, or the haunting voice that calls me in the middle of the night. No, the real horror is knowing that it has already won. It's already inside me, shaping my world, bending it to its will. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. As I sit here now, writing these words, I can hear it. The faint hum in the back of my mind, like the low whir of a copy machine powering on. I know that if I turn around, if I let my guard down for just a moment, it will be there. Watching, waiting. I don't know if this story will ever have an ending. Maybe it already has. Maybe this is the end. Maybe I'm just trapped in an endless cycle of fear and doubt, a prisoner to something I can't even fully understand. But I can't help but wonder if I could go back, if I could change everything. Would I have done anything differently? Would I have stayed away from that machine? Or would I have fallen into its trap just like everyone else? All I know is that no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I'll never escape it. It's part of me now, and so I'll live with it as it waits in the shadows for the next chapter of this nightmare to unfold. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for you too. I had been on the road for days, traveling solo, visiting places I had only ever read about in travel magazines. The idea of a quiet getaway, away from the bustle of everyday life, was all I needed after weeks of work and stress. I had heard about the place from a fellow traveler at a gas station earlier that day. He had casually mentioned the hotel, not with much enthusiasm, but more as an afterthought. Great place for a good night's rest, he had said, looking almost as though he wasn't really sure about it himself. The town, though small and quiet, had an almost timeless charm. With its cobblestone streets and rows of old-fashioned storefronts, it felt like something straight out of a history book. The hotel itself, nestled at the far end of the main street, was an ancient building that looked like it had been standing for centuries. Its weathered brick exterior and faded sign above the door gave it an air of mystery. It was late by the time I arrived, the sky already blanketed in darkness, and the streets eerily deserted. I could hear the crunch of my boots against the gravel path as I walked up to the door. The light above the entrance flickered as I reached for the handle. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with old portraits hanging on the walls and an antique chandelier that had long since lost its luster. The air smelled faintly of dust and age. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, greeted me with a strained smile. Her voice was soft, almost as if she were whispering, despite there being no need. "Welcome," she said, handing me the key to room 207. I wasn't particularly worried about the quiet or the old-fashioned decor. In fact, it gave the place a sort of nostalgic feel. I had stayed in many old hotels during my travels, and each one had its own unique charm. I didn't think much of the receptionist's odd behavior, chalking it up to her age and the silence of the night. She didn't seem overly friendly, but then again, I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to get some rest. I took the key and made my way up the creaky staircase, which seemed to groan with every step I took. The halls were dimly lit, with the flickering light bulbs casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. My footsteps echoed eerily as I walked toward room 207, a door that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The brass number on the door was tarnished, and the door itself seemed to sag slightly in its frame. Unlocking the door, I stepped inside. The room was small but cozy, furnished with an old bed covered in a faded quilt and a rickety wooden nightstand. The curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a small desk lamp that illuminated the room in a soft yellow glow. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, and there was a slight musty smell, as if the room hadn't been aired out in a while. It wasn't unpleasant, though just a reminder of the hotel's age. I set my bag down on the bed and took a moment to stretch. The weariness of the road had begun to set in, and all I wanted was to relax. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and went over to the small bathroom. As I washed up, I could hear the faint hum of the old pipes running through the building, but it didn't bother me. It was just part of the charm of being in an old hotel, right? I grabbed a book from my bag, planning to read for a while before turning in for the night. It wasn't long before the quiet of the room started to settle over me. But there was something about this place, the silence, the heaviness in the air, that made the night feel different from any other. I couldn't quite place it, but it was as if the hotel was watching me, waiting for something. The quiet became more oppressive with each passing minute, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer than they should have. But despite the creeping sense of unease, I told myself it was just the isolation of the place getting to me. It was late after all, and I was tired from the drive. I settled into bed, flicking off the lamp and pulling the covers over me. The quiet felt suffocating, but I wasn't about to let it get to me. As I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned my head to glance at the window. It was pitch black outside, no streetlights illuminating the grounds. The room was completely still, save for the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. I tried to shake the unease from my mind, telling myself it was just an old building, nothing more. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something in that hotel, in that room, was waiting just like I had thought earlier. The air was thick, and the silence seemed to hold its breath, as if the hotel itself was listening to my every move. I lay there for what felt like hours, unable to sleep, the unsettling feeling only growing stronger. Finally, just as I was about to give up and get out of bed, I heard a faint sound, a soft creaking, like the weight of someone walking across the floorboards of the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately sat up, staring into the dark. The noise stopped almost as soon as it had started. I told myself it was just the old building settling, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I lay awake for hours, unable to rest, as the quiet of the hotel wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I wasn't sure what it was, but I had the distinct feeling that this wasn't just another stop on my journey. Something about this place felt different, unnerving, even. And I couldn't escape the thought that the hotel had secrets it wasn't willing to share just yet. But eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted off to sleep, still haunted by the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. I woke up the next morning to the soft glow of daylight peeking through the drawn curtains. The quiet of the room had not left me, but the unease I felt the night before had somewhat subsided, replaced by the mundane realization that I had another day of travel ahead of me. My body still felt heavy from the long drive, and I wasn't in a rush to leave the comfort of the bed. For a moment, I simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of something in a fridge, perhaps, or the air conditioning from another room. It was a strangely comforting noise, almost normal, compared to the eerie silence of the previous night. I stretched, feeling the stiffness in my back from the road. As I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time, I noticed something odd, something that, at first, seemed so small, so insignificant, that I almost brushed it off. The lamp next to the bed, which had been off when I fell asleep, was now on. The light was dim, but it was unmistakably glowing, casting a soft, yellowish ray across the room. I sat up, my eyes squinting in the dim light, trying to process what I was seeing. I distinctly remembered turning the lamp off before going to bed. I had checked everything, made sure the room was completely dark. It was the kind of thing that could easily be explained away: a faulty switch, a power surge, maybe. But the longer I stared at it, the more I felt that creeping sense of something being off again, just like the night before. I got up slowly, the creak of the floorboards underneath my feet making me jump slightly. As I moved toward the lamp, I couldn't help but glance around the room. Everything seemed normal. The quilt on the bed was still ruffled from my restless sleep, the curtains hanging motionless, and the bathroom door slightly ajar. Yet, something about the way the light flickered, the way it seemed to pulse gently, was unsettling. I reached for the lamp switch, half expecting it to turn off the moment I touched it. But as my hand brushed the metal, the light flickered once more, and I felt an odd coldness pass over me, despite the room being warm. I quickly flipped the switch to turn the light off, but the strange sensation lingered. The warmth of the room seemed to fade for a brief moment, replaced by a sudden chill in the air. I stood there, unsure of what to do next. My mind was racing. Was it just a malfunctioning light, or was it something more? I had been alone in the room the whole time, and yet the air in here felt heavier, as though something had just shifted. But I wasn't one to jump to conclusions. I had stayed in old hotels before, and strange things could happen in places like this. A flickering light, a draft. Those were just things that came with age and time. I decided not to think too much about it, shaking my head and blaming it on my overactive imagination. After all, it was early in the morning, and I hadn't had my coffee yet. I went about my routine, brushing my teeth, washing my face, and getting dressed. But the feeling of being watched, of being somehow less alone in the room than I had been the night before, lingered at the edges of my thoughts. It didn't help that the hotel had an odd, almost unnerving quietness to it. The walls felt thick and close, and the air seemed to carry the faintest traces of something ancient. But it was probably just the age of the building, I reminded myself. Old places had a way of making you feel that way. I stepped out into the hallway and noticed, for the first time, how eerily quiet the entire hotel was. The lobby downstairs was empty, as was the hall. The faint hum of the old air conditioning system was the only sound I could hear. I gave a casual nod to the receptionist, who was still at her desk, now engrossed in a newspaper. Her expression was blank, distant, as if she wasn't really aware of my presence. I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than the isolation of the place. After grabbing a cup of coffee from the small cafe across the street, I returned to my room to gather my things. I felt ready to move on, to leave the strange sense of unease behind. But as I opened the door to my room, something caught my eye. The curtains, which I was certain I had left closed, were now drawn open halfway. I stood there for a moment, stunned. How could this have happened? The window was locked. I had checked it myself before leaving. I walked across the room, closer to the window, and found it shut tight, just as it had been when I entered earlier. Yet, the curtains were definitely disturbed. I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my mind, if perhaps I was simply overthinking things. I shrugged it off again and tossed my bag onto the bed, telling myself that nothing strange was going on, that I was simply being paranoid. The strange occurrences could be explained by the quirks of an old building. It wasn't the first time a hotel had creaky floors, flickering lights, or strange drafts. But then, as I began packing my things into my bag, I heard something else this time, more distinct. A soft thud, followed by a scraping noise. My heart skipped a beat. It came from the bathroom, from behind the door that was slightly ajar. The noises weren't loud, but they were unmistakable, like something was moving in there. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to go and check, to open the door and see what was happening, but a part of me was too afraid. What if there was someone in there? What if I was simply hearing things? The thud came again, followed by the scraping sound. I felt a cold sweat start to form on my brow as I took a slow step toward the bathroom door. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob, but I forced myself to turn it to open the door. The bathroom was empty. There was no one inside. But that wasn't the most unsettling thing. The mirror above the sink was covered in fog, despite the fact that the room wasn't steamy. It wasn't just any fog, though. In the center of the mirror, I could make out something strange. It was a handprint, smudged and faint, as if someone had placed their hand there recently. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the mirror. My breathing grew shallow, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't explain it. No one had entered the bathroom while I was gone, and yet, there it was clear as day. The handprint, like a message that had been left just for me. I quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket, telling myself that it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to figure it out. I closed the bathroom door behind me, my mind racing. What was going on? What was happening in this hotel? By the time evening rolled around, the oddities of the past 24 hours were no longer something I could explain away. I had tried, of course, convincing myself that it was all just the result of my own fatigue and the odd quirks of an old hotel. But the more time I spent in that room, the more I felt the weight of something strange and inexplicable hanging over me. That afternoon, I ventured out to the nearby market, hoping to clear my head, but as I walked through the crowded streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't obvious at first. There were people everywhere, moving past me, going about their business. Yet, there was a constant presence in the periphery of my vision, a shadow that seemed to drift in and out of view. I turned around twice, convinced I would catch someone, but each time I found nothing. The paranoia grew, and by the time I returned to my hotel room, I was on edge. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find something changed, something more sinister. But the room was still, the air thick with that unsettling silence. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I had been imagining it all. I dropped my bags on the floor and went to the bathroom to freshen up. As I reached for the tap, I noticed it again, just a slight shift, but enough to catch my attention. The water in the sink was running, just a small trickle at first, but loud enough to fill the otherwise quiet room. I hadn't left it on. I was sure of that. I leaned in closer, listening to the sound as it echoed off the walls. The moment my hand hovered over the faucet to turn the water off, it stopped. The water cut off as abruptly as it had started, leaving me with an uncomfortable silence that felt even heavier than before. My heart raced as I stepped back, my mind reeling. Had I forgotten to turn it off earlier? Or was someone messing with me? I shook the thought away. There had to be a logical explanation, but the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more it felt like I was running out of reasons. I went back into the main room, scanning it for anything out of place. The bed was made, the curtains still drawn, the air thick and quiet. Everything looked untouched, just as I had left it. But something wasn't right. Something was off, and the longer I stood in that room, the more oppressive the feeling became. It was then that I noticed it's something small, but unmistakable. The picture frame on the nightstand, the one with the scenic view of the town outside, had moved. The frame wasn't tilted much, just enough to be noticeable. It had been perfectly straight when I checked it earlier, but now it was slightly askew, like someone had nudged it. I stood there, staring at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced. I had been alone in this room the entire time. There was no one else to have moved it, but it had been moved. I was sure of that. This wasn't just my imagination running wild. The unsettling feeling from the previous night returned, stronger than ever, like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. I walked over to the nightstand, my steps tentative. As I picked up the frame and straightened it, I noticed something else, a faint smudge on the glass. A fingerprint, smudged at the corner, like someone had touched it recently. But I hadn't touched it. No one else had been in here. The air seemed to grow colder as I stared at the fingerprint. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't even begin to explain it. But I had to find out what was happening. The strange occurrences weren't just coincidences. Something was going on in this hotel, something that I couldn't ignore any longer. I decided to take a more proactive approach. I began looking around the room more thoroughly, opening drawers, checking under the bed, and even peering behind the heavy curtains. But the search yielded nothing. There were no hidden messages, no strange objects left behind, no obvious signs of any kind of disturbance. Everything was as it should be, except for the growing sense that something was wrong. As night fell, I tried to shake off the dread creeping over me. I went out for dinner at a nearby restaurant, but the feeling followed me. I couldn't escape it, couldn't stop thinking about the hotel, about the things that had happened inside that room. My appetite was gone, and I quickly finished my meal before heading back. When I returned to the room, I took a deep breath, hoping to calm my nerves. But as soon as I stepped inside, I froze. The door to the bathroom, which I had left slightly ajar earlier, was now wide open. My heart leapt into my throat as I stood there, staring at the dark space inside. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched it since I'd been in there earlier. I cautiously approached the door, my senses on high alert. The bathroom was empty, as expected, but the sense of unease was palpable, thick in the air like the calm before a storm. I slowly backed away from the door, and as I did, something caught my eye. On the bathroom mirror, there was something new, something I hadn't noticed earlier. The fog on the glass had cleared, but now there was writing. A single word, scrawled hastily in a dark, smeared handprint. The word was simple: leave. I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing as I stared at the mirror. How? How had this happened? I hadn't seen anyone else in the room. No one had entered since I arrived back, yet there it was, clear as day. The handprint, the word, it was like a warning, a command. The fear that gripped me was like nothing I had ever felt before. I wasn't alone here. There was something else, something that wanted me to leave. But why? And what would happen if I didn't? I stepped back from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing heavier, as if the very room itself was conspiring against me. My hands were trembling as I wiped the glass clean, desperate to remove the evidence of what I had just seen. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, the word remained, embedded in the mirror as though it had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. The room had changed. It wasn't just the lights, the water, or the strange sounds anymore. There was a presence here, something I couldn't see but could feel, and it was watching me, waiting, as if daring me to stay just a little longer. I couldn't stay in this room any longer, but the moment I thought that, I realized something. I didn't know if I could leave. I didn't know if this place would let me go. The sense of helplessness washed over me, and I knew deep down that I wasn't going to find any answers here. I had to get out, but the question remained. Was I already too late? The clock on the nightstand ticked loudly, each second passing like an eternity. The weight of what I had seen in the bathroom hung over me, a persistent, crushing force that seemed to press against my chest. The handprint on the mirror, the chilling message leave were still fresh in my mind, but they weren't the only thing that was eating at me. It was the silence that had enveloped the room after I'd wiped away the word, the quiet that now seemed unnatural. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I knew that much. But as I stood by the door, preparing to grab my things and leave, a sudden thought stopped me in my tracks. What if I couldn't leave? What if, the moment I tried to walk out, the door wouldn't open? What if I was trapped in this hotel forever? I shook my head, dismissing the thought, trying to ignore the cold chill that ran down my spine. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling as I turned it. The door opened easily, and for a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that relief didn't last long. It was immediately replaced by a deep sense of dread, because as I stepped out into the hallway, I realized something. The hallway was different. It wasn't the same hallway I had walked down earlier. The dim, flickering lights now seemed to be casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. And there, at the far end of the hall, was a figure standing perfectly still, facing the wall. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall and gaunt, dressed in a faded black coat that hung loosely around its body. Its head was tilted to one side, and it didn't move as I approached. My footsteps echoed eerily in the silent hall as I cautiously walked toward it. I wanted to scream, to run back into my room and lock the door, but my feet wouldn't listen. They were glued to the floor, dragging me closer to that figure. As I neared, I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was afraid to speak, afraid that even the slightest sound might provoke whatever this thing was. The figure didn't turn toward me, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It remained still, silent, as if it were waiting for something. And then, just as I was about to pass it, the figure moved. Slowly, so slowly that it felt like time had stopped. Its head turned to face me, and I froze in place. The face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. There was no expression, no emotion, just an empty, lifeless gaze that sent a cold shiver through my body. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. But then, the figure's lips parted. Its voice was low, barely a whisper, but the words were clear, chilling in their simplicity. Leave! The same word I had seen in the mirror earlier, the same word that had haunted me all this time. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was an order, a command. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. The figure didn't move again. It simply stood there, watching me with those lifeless eyes. I turned and ran back down the hall, my feet slamming against the old wooden floors, my breath ragged in my throat. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before it was too late. I reached the staircase at the end of the hall and bolted down the steps, the sound of my footsteps reverberating through the empty hotel. The front door was just ahead, only a few more steps, and I would be free. But as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, panic rising in my chest. The door was locked. I could see the keyhole, but there was no key in sight. I turned around, my eyes frantically scanning the hallway, looking for something, anything, to help me escape. But the hall was empty again, eerily silent. And then I heard a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Something was approaching. My heart nearly stopped as the figure from the hallway appeared again, standing at the top of the stairs. It didn't walk toward me, it just stood there, watching me with those lifeless eyes. I felt my entire body freeze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped. There was no escape. The figure slowly descended the stairs, its movements slow and deliberate. As it got closer, I could feel an overwhelming presence pressing in on me, a sensation of pure dread that made my skin crawl. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. And then, just as it reached the bottom of the stairs, the figure stopped. It tilted its head to the side again, as though considering me. Its cold, hollow eyes never left mine. "You shouldn't have stayed," it whispered. The words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I suddenly understood this wasn't just about leaving. It was about something far worse. I had stayed too long. I had ignored the warnings. And now I was paying the price. The figure raised its hand slowly, and I felt my stomach turn. The air in the room shifted, grew colder, denser, as though something was pulling at me. My limbs felt heavy, my breath shallow. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, unable to break free from the grip of whatever force was taking hold of me. And then I saw it a flash, like a memory that didn't belong to me, a scene from the hotel's past. A man my mind couldn't place his face walking down the very hallway I had just run through, carrying a suitcase. He entered the same room I had stayed in, and after that, nothing. The scene was a blur, lost to time, but the feeling was unmistakable. The man had never left. He had disappeared into the hotel, just like I was about to. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This hotel wasn't just haunted, it was a trap. A place where people came, stayed, and never left. "You'll be one of us soon," the figure said, its voice now cold and hollow, like the very air around us. In that moment, everything snapped into place. I wasn't just dealing with a ghost or some supernatural force. I was dealing with a curse that had claimed others before me and would claim me as well if I didn't act fast. I fought against the weight pressing on me, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. With a desperate scream, I lunged for the door, throwing my shoulder against it with everything I had. The door creaked, groaned under the pressure, and then finally it gave way. I stumbled out into the night air, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to get as far away from that hotel as possible. The streets were empty, the world around me eerily silent, but I didn't care. I was free, or at least I thought I was. I didn't stop running until I reached the train station, but even then, the feeling of something watching me never left. The cold chill in my bones, the lingering sense of dread that followed me like a shadow lead, the figure had whispered. It hadn't been a warning. It had been a sentence. And now, as I sit here, writing this, I still wonder, what happens to the people who ignore the warning? What happens to those who stay too long? Because I know one thing for sure, I'll never go back to that hotel. Not ever. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stood at the train station, my breath shallow and uneven. I couldn't stop shaking. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, but the terror still clung to me like a second skin. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same figure from the hotel standing in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to falter. But there was nothing. Just the empty streets, the dim glow of the streetlights, and the sound of distant traffic. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sense of dread, the weight of that presence, lingered in the pit of my stomach like a poison I couldn't expel. I had escaped the hotel, but I knew deep down that my ordeal wasn't over. I had run away, yes, but I hadn't resolved anything. The mystery of that place, of the thing that had haunted me, remained unsolved. I still didn't understand why the hotel had chosen me, why it had turned its gaze on me in particular. What was it about me that had made me its next victim? I didn't have the answers, and as much as I longed for closure, I wasn't sure I'd ever find it. The train arrived, its lights cutting through the darkness as it pulled into the station. The doors opened with a hiss, and I stepped aboard, still feeling like the world around me was unreal, like I was walking through a dream. I found an empty seat and slumped into it, my body exhausted, my mind a blur. I tried to shut my eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, but the image of that figure, the cold gaze of those lifeless eyes, kept flashing behind my eyelids. The train's movement was rhythmic, soothing almost, but my mind refused to settle. I kept hearing things, the faint sound of footsteps, a whisper of movement in the seat behind me, but every time I looked, there was nothing. I would have sworn I felt eyes on me, but when I turned to look, the car was empty. My heart raced with each false alarm, each flicker of paranoia. The ride was long, but when the train finally pulled into my destination, I had no intention of going home. I didn't want to return to the safety of my apartment, where I'd be alone, where I'd be left to reflect on the horrors I had experienced. No, I needed to talk to someone. I needed to get answers, even if I had to drag them out of the people who lived in that town. The hotel had been nothing but a nightmare, a place of horror, but I needed to understand it, to know what had happened to those who stayed there before me. I made my way straight to the local diner, hoping for a hot cup of coffee and a friendly face. The place was quiet, save for a few patrons hunched over their meals, lost in their own worlds. I approached the counter and sat down on one of the stools. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s with graying hair and tired eyes, gave me a half-hearted smile before walking over. Her apron was worn, and her movements were slow, as if the weight of her years had begun to take its toll. I ordered coffee, my voice unsteady, and she gave me a nod before turning to pour it. I stared out the window, trying to shake off the feeling that I was still being watched. The diner's neon sign flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows against the walls. I had to know more. I needed to understand what had happened at the hotel. When the waitress returned with my coffee, I didn't waste time. I asked her about the place. The hotel, the one I'd stayed at. Her face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "You've been to that hotel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure of what kind of response I was about to get. I was hoping for something that would make sense, something that would explain what I had experienced. Her gaze flickered to the door as if she were checking for eavesdroppers. Then she leaned in closer. "You shouldn't be asking about it," she murmured. "No one talks about that place." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why?" I pressed, my voice low, almost a whisper. "What's wrong with it?" The waitress looked around again before answering. "That hotel, it's been here for decades. Long before I started working here. People come and go, but something about that place keeps them trapped. No one stays there for long. They either check out or they disappear." My heart skipped a beat as I absorbed her words. "Disappear?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with an unspoken fear. "It's not a hotel." "Not really. It's something else. Something that feeds on people. People who stay too long. You're lucky you made it out. Most don't." I leaned forward, desperate to know more. "What happened to them?" "The people who stayed before me?" The waitress shook her head. "They're part of the hotel now. You don't ever leave once you've stayed long enough. Not without paying a price. And that price, well, it's never a good one." I swallowed hard. "So what do you do? What's the point of staying there?" She sighed, as though the weight of the years had taken its toll. "People go in because they think it's just another hotel. They think they can get away from their problems, have a nice night's sleep, and go on with their lives. But the hotel has other plans. Once it gets its claws into you, you're never really free." I felt a pit form in my stomach. The dread I had been feeling all night, the sense that something was chasing me, grew stronger. "So what do I do? How do I stop it?" She looked at me for a long moment, her expression grim. "You can't undo it. You've already been marked. That hotel doesn't let go easily. You're not out of danger yet." A knot tightened in my throat. I had hoped for closure, for some way to break free from the curse that had followed me from that hotel. But instead, I was left with more questions and no answers. The terror was still there, hanging in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me. I had run, yes, but the fear hadn't left. There was a shadow that clung to me, just out of reach, but always there. I paid for my coffee and stood up, my legs unsteady. I needed to leave this town. I needed to get as far away from that hotel as possible. But even as I left the diner, even as I boarded another train, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel wasn't done with me. The figure, the whispers, the handprint in the mirror, none of it was over. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. And I didn't know when that moment would come, or where it would find me. All I knew was that I couldn't escape it. The hotel had taken a part of me, and it wouldn't stop until it had all of me. As I sat on the train, staring out at the passing scenery, I felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. The soft hum of the train was the only sound in the otherwise silent car. The trees outside blurred into a motionless mass as the world around me seemed to move in slow motion. I tried to focus on the passing landscape, anything to distract myself from the constant thought that no matter how far I ran, the hotel was still with me. That thing, the figure, the presence was following me. It was never truly gone. I had left that town, left the hotel behind, but I couldn't escape what it had done to me. It wasn't just the fear, the terror I had experienced in that cursed room. It wasn't just the visions, the whispers, or the handprint. It was the feeling. That feeling of being watched, hunted, marked. Even now, as I sat in the comfort of this train, the walls of the car felt too close, too oppressive. Every shadow seemed to whisper my name. Every flicker of light seemed to mock me. The hotel was never far from my mind, never far from my thoughts. I thought back to that final moment at the diner. The waitress's words had haunted me. "You're not out of danger yet." She had looked at me with those deep, sad eyes, and I had seen something in her gaze, something I couldn't fully grasp. It was a warning, yes, but there was something more to it. She knew. She had seen it before. People like me, people who had stayed too long, who had seen too much, were never really free. I had tried to laugh it off at first, to tell myself it was just a superstition, a story to scare off strangers. But deep down, I knew the truth. That hotel had a way of getting under your skin, of crawling into your very soul. It didn't matter where you went or how far you ran. Once it had claimed you, it never let go. The train rumbled on, but the familiar sense of unease never left. I thought about going to the police, telling them what had happened, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. They'd think I was crazy, some paranoid traveler with too much time on his hands. But I couldn't blame them. I hardly believed it myself, but the terror was real. The cold touch of the figure, the oppressive silence that followed me wherever I went, was real. And yet, as I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder if I was simply letting my fear control me. Was I imagining it all? Was I allowing my mind to run wild, convincing myself that something was out there, waiting for me, when the truth was that it was all in my head? I couldn't shake that feeling, though. The feeling of being watched, the feeling of being followed. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something more. It was something that had taken hold of me in that hotel, something that had latched on like a leech, sucking the life out of me bit by bit. I could still hear the whispers in my mind, still feel the ghostly fingers that had touched my shoulder, still see the shadow of that figure lurking in the corner of my vision. It had become a part of me now, an ever-present companion that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. I thought back to the things I had seen, the empty corridors, the flickering lights, the strange, twisted shape of the figure that had followed me. There were no answers. The hotel had given me no closure, no explanation. It had simply taken, and it had left me with nothing but fear and unanswered questions. I had no idea what had happened to those people who had stayed before me, the ones who had disappeared. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done. It wasn't done with me. As the train pulled into the next station, I glanced at my reflection in the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The person who had gone into that hotel, the one who had come out, was different. My eyes were darker now, haunted. There was a weariness about me, a heaviness that I hadn't carried before. And as I looked deeper, I thought I saw something. A shadow just behind my own reflection. A flicker of movement that didn't belong. I blinked and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. But the doubt crept in, the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. I stepped off the train, my legs unsteady, my heart racing. The station was busy, people milling about, none of them aware of the storm that raged inside me. None of them knew what I had experienced, what I had seen. And for a moment, I wished I could tell them. I wished I could warn them about the hotel, about what it did to you, what it took from you. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. It was too late for me. And no one would believe me anyway. I walked into the night, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The lights above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and wouldn't let go. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself, trying to shake the chill that seemed to come from within, from something deeper than the night air. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from behind me, just beyond my hearing. A voice, distant, but somehow familiar. "You're not free." I froze, my blood running cold. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the street. But I forced myself to move, to keep walking, to keep going. I couldn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, no matter how many cities I visited, no matter how many years passed, I would never truly escape. The hotel would follow me. The figure would follow me. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And when that moment came, I would be ready. Or I wouldn't be. It was the summer of 2015, a time when the world felt full of possibilities, and the scent of adventure was ever present. I had been working long hours at a small tech startup, but the opportunity to take a break finally arrived. A few of my closest friends, people I trusted with my life, decided it was time for a road trip. The plan was simple: a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin in the woods, away from the noise of the city. We needed this. We were all burned out, our minds cluttered with the demands of work and life. I was the one who suggested the cabin. My buddy, Cole, had mentioned it once before, this remote spot in the forest, nestled between mountain ranges. It was perfect for unwinding, and best of all, no one would find us. No signals, no distractions. It was supposed to be the ultimate escape. We would leave the chaos behind and enjoy the peaceful embrace of nature. There were 4 of us on this trip: me, Cole, Tom, and Lucas. We had been friends since high school, and over the years, our bond had only grown stronger. We shared countless memories, many of them wild and unforgettable, but this trip, this was going to be different. For better or worse. Cole was the easygoing one. He had a tendency to be the life of the group, always cracking jokes and keeping the mood light. Tom was more reserved, analytical in his approach to life, but once you got him talking about something he cared about, usually tech, he could go on for hours. Then there was Lucas. He had a darker side, but in a way that made him fascinating to be around. The kind of guy who would keep you on your toes, always unpredictable. It was his idea to take a weekend off and head to the cabin, so in a way, he was the catalyst for this whole adventure. The road was long. Hours of driving, the scenery slowly changing from urban sprawl to sprawling fields, and then, eventually, the trees. Lots and lots of trees. There was something about forests that always seemed to make everything else feel distant, almost unreachable. I remember feeling that tug of anticipation, like a weight lifting off my shoulders as we moved farther from civilization. The last few miles leading up to the cabin were along a narrow, winding road, barely wide enough for our car. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches tangling overhead like a natural canopy, casting eerie shadows on the road. When we finally arrived, the cabin was everything we had hoped for. Isolated, perfectly rustic. The smell of pine and earth filled the air. It was exactly what we needed: peace and quiet, just us and nature. We unloaded our bags and quickly made ourselves at home. There was no Wi-Fi, no signal, just the sound of the wind and the distant chirping of birds. I couldn't remember the last time I had been this far away from the world. As night fell, we gathered around a fire pit out back, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The conversation was light, filled with laughter, but there was a lingering sense of unfamiliarity, something different about the place. Maybe it was the stillness of the forest, or the fact that we hadn't seen another soul for miles. But we brushed it off. It was all part of the charm, right? This was the kind of place where the weight of the world could fall away. I can still hear the crackling of the fire in my mind, the smoke swirling up into the night air, the warmth on my face. We spent the rest of the evening drinking and reminiscing, feeling the rush of freedom that only a secluded place like this could provide. But as the night wore on, something shifted. It was subtle at first. The way the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees in a strange rhythm. The shadows of the branches seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as though they were reaching out toward us. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild, but I noticed the others growing quieter. The light-hearted chatter dwindled, and soon we were all just sitting there, staring into the fire. I looked at Cole, who was usually the most talkative of the group, but now he seemed distracted, his eyes darting nervously around the darkness that surrounded us. Tom, too, had gone quiet, and Lucas. Well, Lucas had that usual intensity in his eyes, but there was something different in his gaze that night. I couldn't quite place it. Then, just as I was about to suggest we head inside and call it a night, we all heard a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A rustling from the trees. It wasn't the winds. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. We all froze. The air seemed to thicken around us, and in that moment, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "What was that?" Tom whispered, his voice tight. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We sat there for a long time, staring into the trees, our minds trying to make sense of what we had heard. But there was nothing. The rustling stopped as quickly as it had started, and the forest went eerily still. I remember turning to Lucas, who had been the quietest of us all since hearing the sound. His expression was unreadable, but his lips were pressed into a thin line. "That wasn't normal," he muttered. "Something's out there." We all agreed, though none of us wanted to admit it aloud. The tension in the air was palpable, and what had started as a carefree adventure was quickly turning into something far more unnerving. But none of us wanted to be the first to leave the comfort of the fire. So we stayed. And that was the moment when everything began to change. The following morning, the forest seemed calm, its eerie presence from the night before temporarily forgotten. We had all agreed to brush off the strange sound we had heard the previous evening, nature, animals, or perhaps the wind. But the air that morning felt different, still heavy with an unspoken tension. The sun had risen high in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as we sat around the small wooden table in the cabin, sipping our coffee. But even with the sunlight streaming in through the windows, there was something off about the place. It wasn't a specific feeling, just a general sense of unease that lingered in the background. We tried to shake it off, to enjoy the freedom of being so far removed from everything, but it clung to us like a second skin. "Who's up for a hike?" Cole asked, trying to lighten the mood. He was always the one to push us into doing something, but this time, his usual enthusiasm was missing. Still, we agreed, not wanting to spend the entire day cooped up inside. As we walked through the forest, the noise of the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. The path was narrow and winding, but it was familiar. Nothing seemed amiss, at least, not until we reached the clearing. It was a small patch of open ground, surrounded by trees on all sides, with wildflowers growing in abundance. But it wasn't the beauty of the clearing that caught my attention. It was the large, dark shape that stood in the middle of it. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree, perhaps a stump or something else natural, but as we got closer, I realized it was too symmetrical, too out of place. It was a stone, but not just any stone. This one was large, and its surface was smooth, unnaturally so, as though it had been placed there intentionally. Its surface had an odd sheen to it, almost like it had been polished recently, despite the fact that it was in the middle of the forest, far from any human settlement. "What the hell is this?" Lucas asked, his voice low. We all approached it slowly, eyes fixed on the stone. There was something about it that seemed off. It wasn't just its size or the strange sheen, it was the feeling it gave off, like it didn't belong here. "What if it's just a weird rock?" Tom suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. He knelt down, running his hand over the surface of the stone. That was when it happened. A sound, faint but unmistakable, echoed from somewhere in the forest behind us, a snap of a twig, followed by a low, distant growl. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but we all heard it. I turned around, my heart racing in my chest. The trees seemed to shift in the breeze, but there was no sign of any animals. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, my voice tight with unease. Cole was the first to respond, his eyes darting around nervously. "Yeah, I heard it." "What the hell was that?" We all stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The sound had come from the direction of the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no animals. It was as if the forest itself had become silent, waiting for us to make a move. "That's it. I'm out of here," Tom said suddenly, his voice trembling. He took a step back, his hand clutching at his chest like he couldn't breathe. "Don't be stupid," Lucas snapped, though there was a hint of worry in his voice too. "We'll be fine. It was probably just some animal." But even Lucas didn't sound convincing. I could see it in his eyes, the same fear I felt creeping in. Something wasn't right. We had come here for peace and quiet, but all we had found was discomfort and confusion. We stood there for a few more seconds, but none of us moved. None of us wanted to be the first to leave. Eventually, Cole broke the silence, trying to make light of the situation again. "Well, if we're all so jumpy, how about we head back? Get some food, maybe play some cards?" We all nodded, too shaken to argue. The hike back to the cabin was quiet, the tension thick in the air. Each of us seemed to be lost in our thoughts, but no one said a word about the stone or the strange sound we'd heard. When we got back to the cabin, we decided to take a break and have some lunch. We were all trying to act normal, but the unease never quite left. It wasn't until later in the afternoon, when we were sitting around the table playing cards, that things took another strange turn. The door to the cabin, which had been firmly shut when we arrived, suddenly creaked open by itself. At first, we all looked at each other, unsure if we had just imagined it. The wind? An animal? But the door wasn't blowing in the wind. It was opening on its own, slowly, as though someone was gently pushing it. "What the hell?" Cole said, standing up immediately. "I swear we shut that door." Tom got up and walked over to the door, checking the latch. "It's locked," he said, but still, the door crept open, inch by inch. It wasn't until the door was halfway open that we all noticed something strange. There was a trail of dark, sticky substance on the floor leading toward the door. It looked like sap, but it was thick, darker than anything I'd ever seen. And the strangest part? It was fresh. "Is that blood?" Lucas asked, his voice strained. "No," I said, swallowing hard. That's not blood." "But what the hell is it?" None of us had an answer, but we all felt that something was wrong. This wasn't just a coincidence. The door opening by itself, the strange substance on the floor, it was all too much. We decided to investigate further, checking every corner of the cabin. But as we searched, it became clear that there was nothing we could explain. The doors, the windows, everything was secure. But that feeling something was watching us, waiting for us, was growing stronger with each passing minute. That was when we realized we were no longer alone in the woods. The strange occurrences that had started in the forest didn't stop. In fact, they only grew more frequent, more intense, each one pushing us further into a sense of unease that we couldn't shake. What had started as a quiet weekend getaway was quickly becoming something far more sinister. Every corner of the cabin felt off, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching us. Each creak of the floorboards beneath our feet sounded like a whisper in the dark, Each gust of wind rattling the windows felt like a warning. The sticky substance we had found by the door didn't dry up. It only thickened overnight, congealing into dark patches that crept toward the edges of the room. We tried to clean it, but no matter how much we scrubbed, it seemed to come back, thicker than before. At first, we blamed it on the forest, on sap, or some other natural thing. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't just that. The nights were the worst. The first night had been unsettling, but by the second night, it was unbearable. Every time we thought about sleeping, a chill ran down our spines, and it wasn't just from the cold. The dark outside seemed to press against the windows, the trees whispering their secrets to each other in the wind, though there was no wind to speak of. I kept hearing noises from the hallway at night, soft scratching sounds that would stop whenever I tried to get up and investigate. The others heard it too, though none of us dared venture out into the hallway alone. There was something waiting there, something that didn't want us to move, didn't want us to leave. We would lie in the dark, pretending to sleep, listening to the silence between the strange sounds, each one heavier, closer than the last. The third day felt like a breaking point. It had rained throughout the night, and the woods were slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. We had all agreed that we needed answers. Something was happening here, something we couldn't explain. So we decided to go back to the clearing where we had found the stone the day before. When we reached the spot, it was as though nothing had changed. The stone sat in the middle of the clearing, unbothered by the rain, the sheen still present on its surface. But as we gathered around it, the same low growl we had heard the night before vibrated through the air again, distant, but this time more persistent, more menacing. My heart skipped a beat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't an animal. No animal made that sound, not in the way it did. "It's coming from the trees," Cole said, his voice hoarse. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling as he pointed into the woods. There was no mistaking it now. The sound was growing louder, closer. We didn't know what to do. We had already made the mistake of venturing into the woods once, and now we were in a situation we couldn't control. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get back to the cabin and lock the door. But something kept us there, something tethering us to the stone, to the clearing. It was like a magnetic force, something that couldn't be ignored. I was the first to move, stepping forward toward the stone, half out of curiosity, half out of dread. The air around it was colder than the rest of the forest, a biting chill that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. My breath fogged in the air as I reached out, fingers hovering just above the surface of the stone. The moment my skin came close, I felt a jolt, a shock that ran through me like static electricity, but far worse, far more intense. Did anyone else feel that? I gasped, pulling my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Yeah, I felt it too," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it. It wants us to touch it." I looked around, meeting the eyes of the others. None of them seemed willing to go any further, and I couldn't blame them. There was a tension in the air now, thick and almost palpable, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. But none of us dared speak it aloud. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees, snapping us all out of our trance. Something was moving through the forest, its steps heavy and deliberate. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it wasn't. No animal moved that way. It was something far more methodical, something far more intelligent. Without warning, we all turned and started running back toward the cabin. We didn't even look back. We couldn't. Whatever it was in the woods, it was closing in on us, and we needed to get out of there fast. When we reached the cabin, we slammed the door shut, locking it behind us. But it didn't feel like enough. The cabin felt exposed now, as though it had no walls, as though we were out in the open, vulnerable. We tried to brush it off, but the strange sounds only grew louder. The growls came from all directions now, circling us, echoing from the trees just outside the cabin. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't the wind we feared. It was what was out there, what was moving in the woods, watching us. We huddled together in the living room, trying to come up with a plan. But there was no plan. How could we leave when we didn't know what was out there? How could we stay when every instinct in our bodies screamed that we were being hunted? The door rattled suddenly, a violent shake that nearly knocked it off its hinges. We jumped back, our hearts in our throats, as the sounds outside grew louder, more insistent. It was like something was trying to get in. That was when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of claws dragging along the cabin's wooden walls. It was slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there was savoring the moment. We had no choice. We had to face it. The door rattled again, louder this time, shaking with enough force to send dust and small debris falling from the walls. The sound of claws scraping against the wood outside echoed in the cabin, sending a chill so deep through my spine that I felt physically sick. The air in the room felt thick, like we were suffocating under the weight of whatever was out there. My hands trembled, and I tried to steady my breath, but it felt impossible. There was no escape. We were trapped. "What the hell is that?" Lucas asked, his voice barely audible. I turned to him, but I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, the words stuck somewhere deep inside me. I didn't want to say what we were all thinking, that whatever was out there wasn't natural, wasn't something we could fight. It was something older, something hungry. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. The walls of the cabin were strong. We were safe, for now. But the growls and scratches outside made it hard to believe that. Each time I glanced at the door, I half expected it to burst open, the thing from the woods rushing in to claim us. "We can't just sit here," Cole said, his voice shaking but determined. "We need to figure out what's going on." His words hung in the air for a moment. What could we possibly do? We had no answers, no weapons, and the thing outside, whatever it was, seemed so far beyond our understanding. Still, despite our fear, there was a part of us that wanted to know. We had to understand what we were dealing with, even if it meant facing it head on. Without saying another word, Cole grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the front door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I grabbed his arm before he could get too far. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You can't go out there." He met my eyes, his face pale and set with a kind of determination that terrified me. "We don't have a choice. We need answers." I didn't know how to argue with that. He was right. We couldn't keep hiding forever. But that didn't make the decision any easier. We had no idea what we were facing. "We'll go with you," Lucas said, his voice a little steadier than mine, though I could see the same fear in his eyes. "We're not leaving anyone behind." I looked around at the others, at Kate, who had been clutching her knees to her chest, her face pale with terror, and Derek, who had been pacing restlessly for what felt like hours. They nodded, as if by some unspoken agreement. We were in this together. For better or worse, we were going to face whatever was waiting for us outside. Cole moved slowly toward the door, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every step seemed too loud in the silence of the cabin, and I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. We all held our breath. I could feel the air in the room grow colder, a suffocating presence hanging over us. The growling outside had stopped, replaced by a stillness that felt almost worse. With a deep breath, Cole turned the knob, pushing the door open a crack. The winds had stopped, and the forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves. But something didn't feel right. The air outside wasn't fresh, it was thick, almost suffocating, like we were standing on the edge of something that shouldn't exist. As Cole stepped out onto the porch, we followed, our feet heavy on the wooden boards. The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, casting long, twisting shapes that seemed to move with the wind. But there was no wind, no movement. The trees stood still, unnaturally so, like sentinels watching us, waiting. "Where is it?" Derek whispered, his voice tight with fear. We all scanned the surrounding woods, but there was nothing. The clearing we had seen earlier, where the stone had been, was now just an empty patch of grass. No sign of the creature, no indication of where it might be. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I tried to make sense of the silence, of the way the world seemed to have frozen around us. And then we heard it, the softest of steps. Too soft to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. Something was out there. Something was watching us. Before any of us could react, the ground beneath our feet shifted. A loud crack echoed through the night, like the sound of a tree being torn from the roots. And then, from the shadows, it came. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. A figure stepped into the light of the flashlight, its skin pale and mottled with strange patches, like old bark. Its limbs were too long, too thin, bending at unnatural angles. The thing's eyes dark, hollow pits locked onto us, and I felt a coldness invade my chest, freezing me to the spot. It opened its mouth, and I heard it, the sound I had been dreading, that low, guttural growl. But it wasn't just a growl anymore. It was a voice that rasped in my mind, as if it were speaking to us from inside our heads. "I've been waiting." The words hit us like a punch to the stomach, paralyzing us in place. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at it, at the twisted, grotesque thing that stood before us, and wonder how we had ever thought we could escape. Cole was the first to react, backing away slowly, but I could see the panic in his eyes. "Run," he whispered, though I could barely hear him over the pounding of my heart. The creature took a step forward, its long arms swinging like branches in the wind. Another growl, lower this time, and the ground beneath us trembled. A sharp, unbearable pain shot through my head as the creature's eyes fixed on me. It wasn't just looking at me, it was inside my mind, twisting everything I had ever known into something dark and alien. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't care about the others, I just needed to get away from it. The others followed, all of us running blindly through the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't far behind. It was coming for us. It was hunting us. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments. The sound of my breath, my pounding heart, and the feeling of something close, something too close. And then, as the world around me spun, there was nothing but darkness. I woke up to the sound of rain. It was soft, steady, a quiet tap against the leaves and the ground. But there was no comfort in the sound. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I wasn't in the cabin anymore. I was on the cold, damp forest floor, shivering despite the warmth of my jacket. The rain had picked up, and the air smelled heavy with earth and something else, something metallic. My head throbbed with every breath I took, and for a moment, I just lay there, trying to gather my thoughts. Everything felt unreal. The forest around me was alive with the sound of rain and rustling leaves, but there was no sign of the creature, no sign of the others. The memory of the thing that had come from the woods flooded back, and I forced myself to sit up, panic clawing at my throat. Had they made it? Was I the only one left? The thought of being alone in that forest, with whatever we had encountered still lurking out there, filled me with a terror so deep it almost made me sick. I pushed myself to my feet, swaying slightly from the dizziness. My hands were trembling, my legs unsteady as I took my first steps. I had to find the others. I had to know if they were okay. I stumbled through the trees, the rain now soaking my clothes, the mud slipping beneath my shoes. My flashlight was gone, but I could still make out some of the trees and paths, the familiar landmarks we had passed earlier. I moved in a haze, my thoughts scrambled, the sounds of the forest around me distant and muffled. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It felt like both, and neither at the same time. The only thing that kept me moving was the thought of finding the others. There had to be someone alive. Then I saw it, the clearing, the place where we had made camp. But it wasn't the same. It was wrong. The ground was scarred, like something had been dragged across it, and the trees surrounding the clearing were bent in unnatural ways. The branches were twisted and broken, as if they had been forced in some violent direction. A chill ran through me as I stepped into the clearing, my heart hammering in my chest. And there, in the center of the clearing, was Cole. He was kneeling on the ground, his back to me. I called out to him, but my voice came out weak, like it had been drained of energy. He didn't respond. Panic surged in me again, and I ran toward him, but as I got closer, I froze. Cole wasn't kneeling. He was slumped over, his face pressed against the dirt. His body was still warm, but lifeless. There was a wound on his neck, deep, jagged, and I could see the blood soaking into the ground beneath him. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "No, no, no." Tears sprang to my eyes, but I couldn't stop staring at him. I couldn't look away from the horror that had happened to him. What had done this to him? What had happened? I dropped to my knees beside him, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. But just before I made contact, I heard the low, guttural growl. It was soft, just a murmur in the air, but it stopped me cold. The blood in my veins froze. I knew that sound. I stood up, backing away, my eyes scanning the clearing for any sign of movement. The rain was coming down harder now, the ground slick beneath my feet, but I couldn't look away from the trees. I couldn't let my guard down. That's when I saw it. It was in the distance, a figure moving slowly through the trees. I couldn't make out its form at first, but as it drew closer, I recognized the shape. It was the creature, the same one we had run from before. Its eyes, those dark, hollow pits locked onto mine. And I felt it again, that overwhelming coldness, that pressure in my chest. It was like it was inside me, twisting something deep within. I wanted to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But then, as if the creature had grown tired of waiting, it lunged forward, its long, twisted limbs snapping through the air. I stumbled backward, my legs buckling beneath me, but I managed to scramble up and run. I ran as fast as I could, pushing my body through the rain, through the trees, not daring to look back. The sounds of its pursuit were like a drumbeat in my ears, growing louder with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged as I stumbled blindly through the forest. The ground beneath me was uneven, my feet sliding through the mud, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, when my legs felt like they were made of lead, I saw it light. The distant glow of the headlights from our car. I could make it. I could get out of here. I pushed harder, my body screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. The light grew closer, and I felt a surge of hope. But then, just as I was about to break through the trees and reach the car, the world went dark. The last thing I remember was the sound of a scream, a sharp, guttural scream, and then nothing. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, the rain still pouring down, but there was no creature in sight. The forest was silent again. The weight that had pressed down on my chest was gone. I looked around. The car was still there, parked at the edge of the clearing. But there was no sign of the others, no sign of anyone. It was as if the world had swallowed them whole. I stumbled toward the car, my legs weak, my mind a blur. The door was unlocked, and I slid into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. The car roared to life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was still out there. I drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly before me, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw shadows moving in the trees. When I finally made it to a small town, I pulled into the first gas station I could find. I was a mess, dirty, drenched, and exhausted. I staggered out of the car and into the station, desperate for help. But when I asked the clerk about the forest, about what had happened, he just looked at me with a blank stare, like he didn't even hear me. "You don't want to go in there," he said, his voice low. "People don't come back from that place. Not the same, anyway." I didn't say anything else. I paid for gas and left. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. That the thing, whatever it was still waiting for me, still watching me from the shadows. The forest was still out there, just beyond the horizon. And no matter how far I drove, I knew I couldn't outrun it. I didn't know if I was still being hunted or if the thing had moved on to someone else. All I knew was that I had left behind more than just my friends. I couldn't sleep that night. The shadows in the corners of my room felt too heavy, like they were breathing with me, following my every movement. The constant hum of the city outside my window did nothing to drown out the sounds that echoed in my head. The rain, the growls, the terror. It all played on a loop, like some twisted nightmare I couldn't wake from. I had hoped that leaving the forest behind would erase everything, but I was wrong. Every night since I left, the nightmares had gotten worse. I'd wake up in cold sweats, gasping for air, feeling like I wasn't alone, even though I knew no one was there. I'd try to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the terror of the forest had just taken root in my brain. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had followed me back. Something had attached itself to me, something dark and patient. I tried to move on. I went back to my old life. I returned to work, to friends, to the mundane routine that I had once considered normal. But it didn't feel the same. I couldn't focus. I couldn't forget what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd experienced. Even in the quietest moments, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, and I couldn't shake the thought that the forest was still there, waiting. I remember walking home from work one evening, the sun setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I passed familiar streets, but something felt different. The air felt thicker, the streets quieter. When I reached the corner where I would normally turn to my apartment, I froze. At the edge of the street, tucked between two buildings, was a small alley I hadn't noticed before. The air around it felt colder, like it wasn't quite right, like it didn't belong. I walked toward it. My footsteps echoed against the walls, a dull thudding sound that made my heart race. As I neared the entrance, I could see something in the distance movement, something large and dark, like a shadow that didn't belong. The moment I stepped into the alley, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, and the familiar city street behind me faded. It was as if the world I knew had disappeared, replaced by something otherworldly. And then I saw it. The trees, tall and twisted, stretching impossibly high, their branches writhing in the air. The dirt beneath my feet was soft, giving way like the forest floor had once done. The sounds of the city were gone, replaced by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant sound of something watching. I felt the familiar cold wash over me, that overwhelming pressure in my chest. My legs felt like lead, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to turn back, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The growl. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more distinct. I could feel it in my bones. I didn't need to look to know what was coming for me. I already knew. It was the thing from the forest, the creature I had tried to outrun, the one that had followed me home. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and grow, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with dread, and I knew without a doubt that I was never truly safe. The forest had never let me go. It had merely waited for the right moment to pull me back in. I tried to scream, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my body trembling. I could feel the presence behind me, feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the right moment. The fear in me was overwhelming, suffocating. But in that moment, I understood something. I wasn't just running from the creature. I was running from myself, from the part of me that had been changed by what I had seen, by what I had done to survive. It was then that I heard a voice, a whisper in the darkness. "You're never really free." I turned slowly, the air growing colder with each passing second, and I saw it, the thing from the forest, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light. Its eyes locked onto mine, dark and endless, and I knew then that it was more than just a creature. It was a part of the forest itself, a part of whatever had claimed us all. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees. The ground felt wet beneath me, the dirt seeping into my clothes, the cold creeping into my bones. The thing moved closer, its form shifting and rippling like smoke in the wind. I could hear it breathing, feel its presence in the air. It was close, too close. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The alley was empty. The trees had disappeared, and I was back on the city street, standing in front of my apartment, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew that the thing was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And I knew that it would never stop. It would never let me go. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep running. I don't know how much longer I can pretend that everything is normal, that I haven't seen what I've seen, heard what I've heard. I don't know if I'll ever be able to escape the forest or the darkness that follows in its wake. All I know is this. Once you've walked into that forest, once you've crossed into that darkness, it never leaves you. You carry it with you, whether you want to or not. And no matter how far you run, no matter how far you think you've come, it's always there just beyond the edge of your mind, waiting for you to remember. And one day, when you're least expecting it, it will find you again. It was only a few months ago when I moved into this house. A small, old property located on the outskirts of a sleepy town, tucked away in a corner that seemed forgotten by time. The kind of place that, on the surface, looked perfect for starting over. My name is Henry, and I had just gotten out of a messy breakup. My old apartment felt too familiar, too full of memories I wasn't ready to keep. So, when I found this house quiet, secluded, and with a price that seemed almost too good to be true, I jumped at the chance. It wasn't a huge house, but it had character. 2 stories, with thick stone walls that were a little weathered, as if the house had lived through 100 years of rain and snow. The wood floors creaked in a comforting way, and the faded wallpaper in the hallway told stories of a bygone era. There was a small garden too, wild and untamed, with vines creeping up the side of the house, almost as if nature was trying to reclaim it. The first few days were nothing but the usual business of settling in. I unpacked boxes, arranged my furniture, and got used to the quiet. The air smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of scent you'd find in a forgotten attic or an ancient library. It wasn't unpleasant, just different. The place felt like it had been waiting for someone, anyone, to move in and breathe life into it once again. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window, watching the sun set behind the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I liked that. I'd spent the last few years caught up in the noise of the city, and this place seemed like a perfect escape from it all. The kind of place where you could sit and think, without the constant hum of traffic or the distant sirens in the background. My daily routine was simple. I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and spent my days working from home. The town was small, and I didn't have any real reason to leave the house often. A couple of times, I ventured into the local grocery store, but most days, it was just me, the house, and the occasional sound of birds outside. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The house was just that, a house. It didn't feel alive in any way, didn't give off any strange vibes. Sure, the house had its quirks, but nothing that would make anyone think twice. The way the floorboards groaned when you walked, or how the front door never quite closed properly unless you gave it a firm push. Little things like that, nothing to be concerned about. The only other person I really spoke to was the neighbor across the street. An older man, Mr. Lawson. He was quiet, reserved, but always polite. Every time I saw him, he'd wave from his porch, and I'd return the gesture. He was the kind of neighbor who didn't ask questions, but made sure to offer advice when it was needed. As days passed, I started to settle into my new routine. I thought that maybe this place would be the fresh start I was looking for. And for a while, it was. But, as with many things in life, the sense of peace wouldn't last forever. I remember one evening, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, I noticed something strange. It was something small, almost insignificant at first. I had just finished eating dinner, and I was heading upstairs to my bedroom. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced down the hallway. The old wooden door at the end of the hall, which I had assumed led to a closet, was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. In fact, I hadn't even thought to check what was behind it. But there it was, half open, as though someone had been inside. At that moment, I shrugged it off. Maybe I had forgotten to close it properly when I had moved in. It wasn't unusual for things to get left open during a move. But as I stood there, staring down the hallway, a strange feeling came over me. It wasn't fear, exactly, but more of a sense of unease. The house had always felt quiet, but now it felt different, like something was out of place. I took a deep breath, walked over to the door, and pushed it open fully. The closet, or so I thought, was nothing more than a small, dusty room with a few old boxes stacked up in the corner. I poked around briefly, but there wasn't much to see. Just old furniture covered in sheets, a few discarded items from the previous owners. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but something about it stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room hadn't been as simple as I thought it was. Maybe it was the way the door had opened on its own, or how the shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. But the moment passed, and I decided that I had imagined it. The next few days followed the same pattern. Work, quiet nights, and the occasional walk around the garden. But as time went on, that feeling, the one that told me something was wrong, grew stronger. I couldn't explain it. There were no loud noises, no creaking doors, no ghostly apparitions. But I began to notice little things. The door that I had checked weeks ago, it was open again, the same way it had been that first night. Just a crack, enough to make me wonder if it had ever been closed at all. And then, one night, as I was sitting in my living room reading a book, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a tapping sound, as though something was gently knocking on the wall. I stood up, walked to the bottom of the stairs, and listened carefully. There it was again, a soft tapping. My heart rate quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. But I told myself it was nothing. The house was old, after all. Old houses made noises. I went back to my book, but the noise persisted. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone in the house. But what could it be? I had no idea, but my peaceful life was about to take a turn. A turn I wasn't ready for. The days after the tapping sound upstairs were filled with an uneasy stillness. It was as if the house had decided to go quiet, almost as if it was waiting for me to either forget or to delve deeper into the mystery that had just begun to unfold. But I didn't act on it immediately. After all, I reasoned with myself that old houses made noises all the time, and the wind could create all sorts of sounds when it moved through the cracks in the walls. But as the days passed, the odd occurrences began to stack up, one after another, each one more unsettling than the last. It was a Saturday morning when the first real sign of something unusual happened. I had been up late the night before, working on some freelance projects, and was still groggy when I woke up to the faint scent of something burning. At first, I thought it was just the remnants of the smell of last night's dinner, or maybe I had left a candle on. But as I walked into the kitchen, the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I glanced at the stove. Nothing was on. The oven was cold, and there was no sign of any fire. Confused, I walked through the rest of the house, checking each room. Everything seemed fine until I reached the hallway upstairs. As I stood at the foot of the stairs, a sudden chill gripped me. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the temperature drop, like stepping into a cold draft. It was a stark contrast to the warm air in the kitchen. My skin prickled, and I instinctively pulled my sweater tighter around me. I told myself that it was probably just a draft. The house had old windows, after all, and maybe one of them wasn't sealed properly. But as I walked through the hallway toward the staircase, I noticed something else. The hallway light, which I had left on the night before, was flickering. It wasn't just a slight flicker, either. It was almost as if it was struggling to stay on, dimming and brightening in an erratic pattern. I froze in place. A slight sense of panic crept over me, but I quickly dismissed it. It was just the old wiring, I thought. Maybe I needed to replace a bulb. I took a deep breath and ascended the stairs. As I passed the door to the small room at the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door, which I had checked just days before, was now completely closed. It didn't seem right. The last time I had seen it, it was barely ajar. Had I closed it fully and just forgotten? I didn't know. I paused for a moment, staring at the door. I could feel my heart begin to race. It wasn't the door itself that bothered me, it was the sense of something being out of place. Something I couldn't put my finger on. I walked toward it slowly, my hand hovering near the doorknob. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to open it again, to check, and so I did. As the door creaked open, I was immediately hit with a strong, musty smell like wet earth, but stronger, almost suffocating. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. The room looked the same as it had before, but there was something different about it. Something wrong. I scanned the room, my gaze falling on the old furniture and the boxes in the corner. And then I saw a small, old-fashioned key lying on the floor in the center of the room. It hadn't been there before. My mind raced. I bent down and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. It was a simple thing, brass, worn with age, but there was something off about it. Something about the way it glinted in the dim light that made me shiver. My pulse quickened, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a creeping sensation of dread deep in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know what to make of it. Why was it there? What was it for? I stood in the room for a while, holding the key, trying to make sense of it all. But nothing made sense. I went downstairs, placing the key on the kitchen counter, and tried to get back to my day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had once felt like a quiet refuge, now felt like a place I didn't understand. The events didn't stop there, though. In the following days, other strange occurrences began happening with more frequency. It started with the sounds again, this time heavier, more pronounced. At night, as I sat in the living room, I would hear a distinct sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, as though someone were walking through the hall upstairs. At first, I convinced myself that it was just the house settling, but when the footsteps persisted, even when I knew I was alone, I couldn't ignore them. I tried to stay calm. It was easy to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then, there was the knocking. A faint tap, tap, tap on the walls, always at night, always when I was alone. I began to lose track of time, the hours slipping by as I waited for the sounds to stop. They never did. I spoke to Mr. Lawson about it one afternoon when we crossed paths in front of our homes. He gave me a knowing look, one I couldn't quite place. "Old house, isn't it?" he said, his voice almost too soft, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hearing things, but it's probably just the house settling, right?" He chuckled, but there was something off about his smile, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Maybe," he said, "but you never know with houses like that. They have a way of hiding things." His words lingered with me long after our conversation ended. What did he mean by that? Was there something I didn't know? I decided to investigate further. But every time I returned to that room at the end of the hallway, something stopped me. The door would be closed, as though it were mocking me, daring me to open it again. And every time I reached for the handle, I felt that same icy sensation like something was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. But the most unsettling thing was that the key, the one I had found on the floor, had disappeared. I had left it on the kitchen counter, but when I went to check the next morning, it was gone. I searched the house, even the yard, but I couldn't find it. It was as though the key had never existed in the first place. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had held. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with something simple. This house, this place, was hiding something. Something it didn't want me to find. And every time I got closer to uncovering the truth, it pushed back harder. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to keep going. I had to find out what was hidden in this house, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a blur. It felt like the house itself was becoming more alive, more aware of my every movement. The strange events, which I had once tried to dismiss, were no longer isolated incidents. They had become an ongoing nightmare, each one more disturbing than the last. At night, the sounds continued. The tapping, the knocking, always just out of reach, just beyond my understanding. There was a time when I thought I could convince myself that these were just the noises of an old house, but no longer. The house was changing, or maybe I was changing in response to it. The footsteps upstairs had increased, now accompanied by whispers, soft, indistinguishable murmurs that seemed to float down the hallway. I'd stand frozen, listening, but just when I thought I could catch the words, they would stop, leaving me with nothing but an eerie silence. The air around me would feel thick, like the weight of 100 unseen eyes was pressing down. My heart would pound in my chest, and I'd feel this overwhelming urge to run, to escape whatever was in this house with me. But where would I go? This place was my home now. I started to keep a journal, writing down the events as they happened, hoping that the act of documenting them would somehow make sense of it all. But each time I wrote something down, it felt like the house was mocking me, as if the words on the paper weren't enough to contain the horror that was brewing within its walls. The first sign that things were escalating came one evening as I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. It was around 9 p.m., the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, the book slipping from my hands onto the floor. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I slowly made my way toward the stairs, each step heavier than the last. As I reached the foot of the stairs, the sound stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I hesitated, my breath shallow and rapid. What was I supposed to do? Was I going to find the source of the noise? Or was I about to walk into something I wasn't prepared for? Taking a deep breath, I ascended the stairs. The air up here was colder, the chills settling into my bones. As I moved down the hallway toward the room at the end, I noticed something. The door was cracked open again. This time, the light inside flickered erratically, casting strange shadows against the walls. I walked closer, feeling my pulse quicken. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me inside. I stepped in, and my eyes immediately fell to the floor. There, in the center of the room, was a large black stain like something had been spilled and had seeped into the old wooden boards. But there was something worse than the stain. It was the smell, sweet and rotting, like something had died in here. It was overwhelming, gagging me as I stepped further into the room. My eyes darted around, but there was nothing else out of place, no sign of what could have caused the mess. Just the stain, just the smell. I backed away, my heart racing, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I had to get out of this room. I had to get out of the house. But when I turned around to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. My breath caught in my throat, and I pounded on the door, shouting for it to open. But nothing happened. It was as if the house was playing a cruel game with me. I don't know how long I stood there, pounding and yelling, but eventually the door creaked open on its own, as though it had decided I could leave. I stumbled out of the room, my legs shaky, my mind reeling. I couldn't deny it anymore. This house was not just old, it was something else. It was alive, and it had a history, one that it wasn't willing to let me forget. Over the next few days, the occurrences only became more frequent. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. The house seemed to be reacting to my every move, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. The lights flickered, sometimes going out completely, leaving me in the dark. The temperature would fluctuate wildly, from unbearable heat to biting cold. And then there was the smell, sometimes faint, other times overpowering, always carrying the same rancid odor that filled my nose with every breath. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just keep ignoring the truth. There was something in this house, something dangerous, something that wanted me to uncover its secrets. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the front door. I'd been pacing the house for hours, unable to focus on anything but the growing dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pushed towards some truth that I wasn't ready to face. I walked to the back of the house, where the small room at the end of the hall sat. The door was still open. I hesitated for a moment, but then I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed different now, like it had changed since the last time I'd been in here. The air was thick with that strange scent, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls like something alive. I walked across the room, my feet light against the floor. The door at the far end of the room, the one that had been locked before, was now standing open. I stepped toward it, my breath catching in my throat. The door led to a narrow staircase, descending into the darkness below. It was unlike anything I had seen in this house before. I hadn't known there was a basement. I stood at the top of the stairs, trying to steady my shaking hands. The house had kept this from me, and now it was showing me the way. I took a step forward, then another, my feet heavier with each descent into the unknown. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every step I took. The darkness enveloped me, and the sounds of the house seemed to fade away, replaced by the beating of my own heart. The basement was unlike anything I could have imagined. It was small, cramped, and smelled of damp earth. The floor was covered in thick layers of dust, and the walls were lined with old crates and boxes. But it wasn't the appearance of the basement that took my breath away. It was the feeling in the air. There was something down here, something watching me. I turned to leave, but before I could, I heard the sound of something moving in the shadows. A cold hand gripped my shoulder, and I whipped around, my eyes wide with fear. There was no one there. The basement door slammed shut behind me, and the house seemed to breathe, holding its breath as if waiting for me to make the next move. I knew then that there was no escaping whatever lay within these walls. The house had claimed me, and it wasn't letting go. I needed answers, and I was determined to find them, no matter the cost. The air felt heavier now, as if the house itself was closing in on me, suffocating me with its secrets. I couldn't ignore it anymore, the overwhelming sense of dread that had been building for days, maybe weeks. The house had been warning me, pulling me closer with every strange noise, every unexplained event. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, I could feel it. Whatever had been lurking in the darkness of this place was ready to reveal itself. I stood frozen in the basement, the door behind me slamming shut as if to seal my fate. The coldness that had gripped my body earlier intensified, sinking into my skin and creeping through my bones. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, but it felt like the sound was swallowed up by the oppressive silence surrounding me. The house had gone still, as if waiting for the moment to arrive. The dim light hanging from the ceiling flickered, casting erratic shadows against the stone walls. I tried to steady my breath, but it caught in my throat as I took a hesitant step forward. The basement was suffocating. The air felt thick with an ancient presence, one that had been hiding in the corners, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was trembling now, my hands slick with sweat as I reached out toward the nearest crate. The heavy weight of the boxes, covered in dust and grime, only added to the unease pressing down on me. I could hear the faintest rustling, like something was moving just beyond my line of sight, but when I turned, there was nothing there. A sudden chill ran up my spine, and I knew it wasn't just the temperature. Something was wrong. This wasn't a normal house. It wasn't just the creaks of an old building settling or the occasional draft. It was something else. Something alive. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to understand what this place was, what it had been hiding from me all this time. My legs were shaky as I moved deeper into the basement, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. As I reached the far corner, I saw a large, dusty rug rolled up and pushed to the side. I had never noticed it before, and yet something about it pulled at me. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I tugged the rug aside. Beneath it, there was a trapdoor. It was small, rectangular, and made of dark, aged wood. The edges were chipped and splintered, as if it had been opened many times before. My mind screamed at me to turn away, to leave before whatever waited behind that door could reach out and claim me. But I couldn't. The lure of the unknown, the need for answers, was too strong. With a grunt, I lifted the trapdoor, the hinges creaking loudly in protest. The moment it opened, a cold gust of air rushed up from below, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay. I recoiled, choking on the foul stench, but I forced myself to peer into the darkness below. It was a staircase, narrow, steep, and coated in layers of dust. The light from above barely reached the first few steps, but I could see enough to know that there was something down there. Something that hadn't been touched in years, perhaps decades. I hesitated. My mind was screaming for me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I had to know what lay below. Slowly, cautiously, I began to descend the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to stretch out before me, as though trying to swallow me whole. When I reached the bottom, I found myself standing in a small room, even darker than the basement above. The walls were bare, save for a few rusty chains that hung from the ceiling. The floor was covered in thick layers of dust, but something stood out, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a stone altar. It was old, worn, and covered in cracks, but it was undeniably there, as if it had been waiting for me. I took a hesitant step forward, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was something wrong about this place, something that didn't belong. It wasn't just the altar itself, it was the energy, the heaviness that filled the air. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the altar. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and a deep, guttural noise rose from somewhere below, as if the house itself was waking up. I jerked my hand back, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The noise grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from beneath the floor. The earth itself seemed to groan, like something ancient and powerful was stirring below. I backed away from the altar, my eyes wide with fear, but my movement only seemed to provoke whatever was down there. The walls began to crack, the ceiling above me creaking as if the entire house was groaning in pain. Then, with a violent crash, the floor beneath me buckled, sending me sprawling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my throat as the room seemed to collapse around me. The altar had cracked open, revealing a deep, black pit beneath it. The air grew thick with an unholy presence, and I felt a surge of terror like nothing I had ever known. From the pit, something began to rise. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe with words. All I could see were its eyes glowing, red, and filled with an ancient malice. It was the eyes of something that had been buried for centuries, something that had waited in the dark for the moment to rise again. I could hear it now, its voice, a low, rasping growl that reverberated in my skull. It wasn't speaking in any language I knew, but I could feel its hatred, its hunger. The presence pressed in on me, suffocating me, pulling me toward it. I ran. I don't remember how, but somehow I found myself back in the basement, scrambling for the stairs. The house was alive now, shaking, groaning, as if the very foundations were being ripped apart. I could hear the thing from the pit moving, its voice calling to me, chasing me. I reached the trapdoor and pulled it open, but the air felt too thick. The darkness pressed in around me, and I felt a hand cold, like death brush against my shoulder. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I pushed myself up through the trapdoor, my heart racing, my limbs trembling with fear. When I reached the basement door, it wouldn't open. I was trapped. I could hear it behind me now, the thing from the pit, its growl growing louder with each passing second. The walls seemed to close in, the house shaking, crumbling as if it was collapsing under the weight of what had been unleashed. My heart was in my throat as I pulled at the door again, desperate to escape. Finally, it creaked open. I didn't stop running until I was outside. But as I stood there, gasping for air, I could feel that the presence still there, in the house, in the shadows. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever I had unleashed wasn't finished. It had only just begun. The house would never let me go. I stood outside, the cool night air biting at my skin as I tried to catch my breath. My heart still pounded in my chest, every beat reverberating in my ears. I didn't look back at the house. I couldn't, but I could still feel it, that heavy, oppressive weight pressing against me, urging me to turn around, to face whatever waited for me inside. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but something held me there. Something inside me, something that I couldn't explain, forced me to stay, even as the terror continued to churn in my gut. The house had always felt strange. Even when I first moved in, I knew something wasn't right. But I had never imagined this, never believed the stories I had heard about haunted places and the evil they contained. But I had seen it with my own eyes. Whatever had been hidden beneath that house, it wasn't something that could be easily explained. I glanced toward the front door, still open from when I had fled. The wind howled, causing the door to creak on its hinges. But I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. What I had discovered in that basement, what I had unleashed, was too much to face again. I knew I couldn't go back. But leaving, it wasn't enough. I had to make sure that whatever was in that house never left. I couldn't bear the thought of it spreading, of it finding new victims. But how could I stop something like that? What could I do to stop a presence that felt so old, so malicious, from continuing to haunt that house? My first instinct was to call for help, to get out of there and tell someone what had happened. But who would believe me? Who would understand what I had seen? The house was old, yes, but not ancient enough for the locals to believe in supernatural horrors. They'd write it off as my imagination, a tired mind playing tricks after a long day. And even if someone did believe me, what could they do? There was no exorcism that could banish what was down there, nothing that could stop the thing that had been released. I thought about calling the police, but then I realized they wouldn't be able to help either. What would they do? Go in and check. Nothing could be seen on the surface. There were no signs of foul play, no physical evidence of anything abnormal. To them, it would be just another unsettling old house. And they wouldn't be able to do anything when things started to get strange. I was left with nothing but the haunting knowledge that I had disturbed something that was meant to stay buried. As I stood there, contemplating what to do, the house loomed before me in the dark, like a sleeping monster. I could still feel its pull, like it was calling me back, like it was waiting for me to return. I could feel it in my bones, the way it pressed on my chest, begging me to enter, to face what I had disturbed. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. Still, I didn't leave. I knew I had to make a decision, and fast. The only way to deal with something like this was to cut ties with the house completely. I couldn't risk staying there, not after what I had seen. I had to walk away, no matter how hard it would be. I finally turned and made my way down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. I had no plan, no backup. I didn't even know where I was going, but I had to get away from that place. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the main road, my mind spinning as I tried to come to terms with what had just happened. My chest was tight, my stomach a mess of nerves. There were no answers, no solutions. Nothing to explain the horror I had just witnessed. But what could I do? The world was too big, too full of mysteries, and I was just one person. What could I possibly do against something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries? Something that had been waiting for the right moment to escape, to be unleashed into the world? Nothing, I realized. I had no power over it. And it terrified me to know that, in some way, it would never really leave me. It would always be there, a dark shadow that I could never outrun. As I made my way down the road, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. A car driving toward me. It was a small comfort, knowing that there were other people out there. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt in that moment. The car slowed as it came closer, its driver clearly startled to see me standing there in the middle of the road, looking like a wreck. "Hey, are you okay?" The driver called, rolling down the window. I nodded, trying to appear normal, trying to hold it together. But I could feel the weight of what had happened pressing on me, pulling at my soul, and I knew I wasn't okay. I would never be okay. "I'm fine," I managed to say, forcing the words past my dry throat. The driver didn't seem convinced, but nodded anyway. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. If only it were that simple. But I didn't have the energy to explain. I didn't have the energy to tell anyone what had really happened. So I simply nodded again and watched as the car drove away, the headlights fading into the distance. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that house. I couldn't stay there, trapped in its dark grip. I had to leave it behind, even if the house never truly let go of me. I made my way to the nearest town and checked into a small motel, though the dread still lingered in my chest. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, those glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness. And I knew, deep down, that the house would never forget me. It would never stop calling. I don't know how long I stayed in that motel. Days, maybe weeks. I lost track of time, consumed by the fear that never left me. Eventually, I left, too terrified to stay in one place for too long. And I never spoke of the house to anyone. I couldn't bring myself to. The terror was too much, too real. And the worst part was that I knew it wasn't over. What I had unleashed wasn't done with me. It wasn't done with anyone. The months that followed were a blur. I tried to put everything behind me, to return to some semblance of normal life, but the truth is, I couldn't escape what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the cold, clammy air of the basement, hear the unnatural creak of the door that had once been sealed shut. No matter where I went or how hard I tried to move on, a part of me always lingered back at that house, trapped in the nightmarish reality I had unwittingly unleashed. I moved around. I tried living in different cities, different states, but the feeling never left me. It was as though the house had imprinted itself on my very soul, a permanent scar that no time or distance could erase. In every dark corner, in every old building I passed, I could almost hear the faint whisper of its presence, like a call that wouldn't let me forget. I couldn't tell anyone the truth. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do? The thing I had unleashed didn't care about laws or the modern world. It existed in a realm far older, far darker, and far more unforgiving than anything we could understand. People would chalk it up to a mental breakdown, to stress, or some bizarre coincidence. I had no proof, no physical evidence, just my word, and in the end, that didn't mean much. I've spent years running, trying to forget, trying to ignore the nagging sense of dread that's constantly at the back of my mind. But no matter how much I try to move on, the memories never fade. They just get sharper, clearer. The shadows in the corner of my vision never seem to go away. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself checking the locks on the doors and windows, making sure nothing is creeping up behind me, waiting for the right moment to pounce. I've tried everything to find peace. Therapy, medication, meditation, changing my environment over and over. But nothing helps. Because deep down, I know the truth. I can never escape what I did. The house isn't just a place. It's an entity. It's alive in its own twisted way, and it has a long memory. Sometimes, when I walk alone in a quiet neighborhood, when the night is still and the only sound is the wind rustling through the trees, I catch myself looking over my shoulder. My breath catches in my throat. I feel it's something watching, waiting. I can't say for sure if it's the house itself or just the terror that clings to me, but I know one thing for sure. I can never truly escape. I often find myself thinking about the people who might move into that house in the future. Maybe someone else will come along, thinking they're getting a fresh start in an old house, oblivious to the darkness buried beneath its foundation. But then I remember, with a shiver that runs down my spine, that there's no escaping it. It's there, waiting for them, just as it was waiting for me. The house doesn't care who walks through its doors. It doesn't care how many years pass or how many people try to forget its existence. It's always there, always watching, always hungry. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I know that it will never be satisfied. I think about the way it seemed to grow stronger the more I uncovered, the more I searched. It wanted to be found. It wanted to be released. I don't know if there's anything left of me, anything left of my sanity, my peace of mind, after all this time. But I do know this. That house will always have a hold on me. And if there's anyone reading this who ever finds themselves near an old house, an abandoned place with a history you don't know, be cautious. Because sometimes, some places, they're better left alone. In the end, maybe that's the only lesson I learned. That some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some things, once unleashed, will always come back to find you. I've tried to forget, but I can't. And deep down, I know it's never really over. No, it's never over.